Hi, it's my privilege to open day 2 of Jehu's Tribute, or the Jehu Conference, as I've been calling it. I am Ranfred from Wichita State University, and I welcome you warmly back to the second day of our conversation in further pursuit of the question, what can biblical studies offer Assyriology? Yesterday's speakers reminded us with a wealth of background, foundation, and challenges for further thought. We were reminded of the history of our disciplines and their interaction and the meta challenges of comparative work. That was with Peter Machinist. We revisited the close relationship between biblical studies, Assyriology, and archaeology of the area, with innovative ideas for remodeling of the house that may not have had enough rooms, or at least needed updating, that includes more decision makers. It will likely be a messier house with more occupants, but I think that's a good thing. That was with Alice Mandell. That reminded me actually of a visit to the site of ancient Ur back in 2001, where an enthusiastic tour guide showed us the house of Abraham. He showed us what was a maze of modern reconstruction with the argument that Abraham's house had many rooms, and this house has many rooms. Perhaps most interesting was the plaque that stood in front of the house that said, Abraham did not establish any nation. Anyway, yesterday's session went on to focus on ways in which biblical studies, or the Bible in our present culture and theology, inspires and empowers very specific presentations of biblical and ancient Near Eastern history and culture to the public, challenging us as academics to enter the fray of ideological competition in how to curate that interface. The flood experience, Gina Konstantopoulos reminded us. The Ark experience, the Creation Museum, the Museum of the Bible, they're formidable institutions. Though I admit I had a different contribution in mind when I was asking about the contribution of biblical studies, but by the way, perhaps the biblical texts have something to teach us all here, since they are no stranger to propagandistic twists, of which Jehu's story is an excellent example. Finally, Avi Winitzer gave us an inspiring big picture commentary on the meaningful tribute from biblical studies as a gateway to the West, a window onto old, important questions that lets in the Geist, and then with Beate Pongratz-Leisten, a tour de force demonstration of what true interdisciplinarity has to offer, but also a reminder of the hard fact that methodology and meta-perspectives require stringent buildup of bodies of knowledge. Today, we will hear from another excellent slate of speakers, and we'll go to what we have conceived of as case studies. So please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Martin Nissinen, Professor of Old Testament Studies at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Theology.
Thanks, Ranfred. Good evening, everyone. It's 8 p.m. in Helsinki. First of all, I would like to thank Jeff, Ranfred, and Sarah for organizing this wonderful event. I'm really honored to be one of the speakers. What can biblical studies offer Assyriology? I would like to offer the book of Ezekiel as a representative of literature produced by a non-dominant group, possibly or even probably in Babylonia, negotiating its own identity. Nothing like this can be found in cuneiform sources. Hence, the book of Ezekiel provides a perspective that is totally absent from cuneiform literature. And now I'm sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay. And now I don't come any further from here. I can tell you 10 minutes ago this was really working well. Not now. Okay, good. Thanks. So, to be able to use the much debated concept of identity in a meaningful way, we need to recognize its multidimensional and intersectional character. An identity can be individual or collective. A person can have multiple, more or less coherent identities depending on her or his position. The identity of an individual or a community may be self-proclaimed or imposed upon. Identities may be based on kinship, profession, religion, social status, you name it. Ancient Near Eastern identities are most often studied still from the point of view of ethnicity, perhaps even to the extent that the concepts of ethnicity and identity have been virtually fused together. This is not only due to conventional and outdated constructions of nations, so-called, as forming fixed and stable ethnicities and identities, but also to the fact that people living in Mesopotamia had different geographical backgrounds, spoke different languages, and represented different religious and cultural traditions. This diversity cannot be boiled down to a system of ethnic identities, let alone nations in ancient Mesopotamia, but it cannot be ignored either. The diversity of people is largely due to imperial policies involving forced migrations of huge amounts of people. The mass deportations are not the only reason for people's diversity, though. The deportations are well reported in the royal inscriptions, but only scarcely mentioned in texts dealing with daily life and politics. It is usually difficult to know whether the presence of a person mentioned in these sources is due to forced or voluntary migration. Defining identities on the basis of gentilics, personal names, and other features we interpret as markers of identity and/or ethnicity is problematic in many ways. People of different origins are identified by various types of gentilics, and the personal names represent a wide variety of languages other than Akkadian. It is not self-evident, however, that the categories presented in the sources correspond to either the people's own identifications or to the modern scholarly categories. The self-identification of a group may or may not be identical with its external social recognition by others in the sources. The primary reason for designating a person or group may or may not be the need for a precise identification of origin, and it may serve different political and ideological purposes. It is necessary to find out whether the origin can be seen as an identity marker of a specific group, whether people of the same origin tend to form social networks with each other, and how people may renegotiate their origin-based individual or group identities. And this is all about Ezekiel. The written sources that we have at our disposal are for the most part authored from the perspective of the dominant group, that is, Assyrian and Babylonian royal court and local administration. There are no cuneiform texts that would consciously and programmatically represent the point of view of a self-defined minority group. However, certain parts of the Hebrew Bible serve as a unique and indeed the only examples of texts composed by members of a minority group in Mesopotamia constructing their own identity. That is, the people from the former kingdom of Judah, many of whom were deported to Babylonia after the conquests of Nebuchadnezzar II in 597 and 586 BCE. The existence of the resettled Judean population is not a literary fiction. It is documented by cuneiform evidence coming from Babylonia proper. It is well known that the major change, whether in terms of society, religion, or identity, took place in the aftermath of the conquest and eventually the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian forces. Judah suffered severely from the destruction, surviving as a post-collapse society that for a long time could only maintain a subsistence economy due to a substantial loss of population and resources. On the other hand, the forced migration of the royal court and a large number of Judean citizens to Babylonia caused an inevitable change of their collective identity from citizens of a small Iron Age kingdom to members of provincial and diaspora communities. A similar change took place earlier when Assyria annexed the northern kingdom of Israel as part of its conquests in the Levant in 720s, resettling people from there to other parts of the Assyrian Empire and moving other people to its region. To what extent the change and formation of the identity of the Judeans was not only caused by a Mesopotamian empire, but actually took place in Mesopotamia, is another question not easy to answer for various reasons. The conquests and destruction of Jerusalem and the subsequent deportations are thoroughly reflected in many texts within the Hebrew Bible as a significant part of the social memory of the people among whom the texts were written. Modern scholarship has considered the so-called exile a watershed in the history of biblical Israel, decisive even for the formation of the writings that were to form the Hebrew Bible. The deportation of the Judeans is undoubtedly a historical event, just as the resettlement of people from Samaria in cities ruled by Assyria in 720s BCE. Just like the dispersed Samaritans can be found in Assyrian sources, the presence of Judean population in Babylonia has left clear traces in the Babylonian record. On the other hand, the exile is an ideological construct, whether ancient or modern. The texts reflecting this event were not written out of the need to document the deportation and diaspora, but rather to make sense of it through a temporally and geographically extended process of interpretation. The biblical perspective on the exile places Jerusalem in the center, but we have to ask whose center it actually was and what defines the perspective. The theological reflection of the end of the Northern Kingdom and its aftermath is different from the discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile because of the different perspective from which Jerusalem appears as central and Samaria as peripheral. The insider view on the fall of the Northern Kingdom is minimally represented in biblical texts, even though the political and demographic changes were equally pregnant with consequences. Our knowledge about how the identities of the dispersed Samaritans and other northerners developed in their new environments is equally minimal, even though many Samaritans mentioned in Assyrian sources appear in relatively good positions. No written records produced by themselves has been preserved, and we do not know if such texts ever existed. The long process of the change of the identity of the Judeans, on the other hand, is abundantly documented in the Hebrew Bible. For the most part, the texts reflecting and constructing the new identity, such as Joshua Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the book of Jeremiah, were written and edited in Jerusalem during the so-called Second Temple period from the 6th century BCE onwards. Hence, the biblical texts reflecting the exile cannot be read as exil literature that is written in the exile. Even the texts reflecting the Babylonian circumstances were not necessarily written in Babylonia. Nevertheless, the very imagination of the Judean prophet sending a letter to the community of Judeans in Babylonia, Jeremiah 29, implies the idea that such a correspondence indeed could take place, and some of its recipients could read the letter and respond to it. People with writing skills most probably belonged to the group brought to Babylon together with other members of the Judean court, whose presence in the custody of the Babylonian court is evidenced by the so-called Beate tablet. To what extent biblical texts are likely to derive from the Judean community or communities in Babylonia is difficult to define. The so-called Deutero-Isaiah has often been argued to derive from Babylonia, although this is not the unanimous opinion of today's scholarship. There is a widespread agreement on the origin of the book of Ezekiel in Babylonia, but even this is not disputed, and the long process of textual transmission warns against reading the book in its entirety, the product of the Judean exiles who wrote it in Babylonia. However, the change of identity this book reflects is explicitly localized in Babylonia, and the diaspora identity and the troubled dichotomy between Jerusalem and Babylonia is present in all parts of the book. Now, the oldest manuscript evidence of the book of Ezekiel, as any other book of the Hebrew Bible, comes from 6 fragments from Qumran and Masada, dating to the 1st century BCE. The textual witnesses testify to a process of transmission that makes it impossible to read the Masoretic Hebrew text as identical to a text of any book that existed in the 6th century BCE. The lack of manuscript evidence from earlier periods leaves us in uncertainty not only about the time and place of writing, but also about the authors and audiences of the book of Ezekiel and its early history of emergence. Therefore, even the question of its author's location in Babylonia rather than in Jerusalem is not a matter of course. The implied speaker, the prophet Ezekiel, addressing the implied audience, the Judean community, within the implied historical setting, Babylonia in the early 6th century BCE, cannot be straightforwardly identified with the historical authors, audiences, and settings of this text. Thus, reading the book of Ezekiel as the product of the Judean minority groups in Babylonia cannot be based only on the virtual world of the book itself. It must be argued for. The book itself identifies Ezekiel as a priest located by the Kebar River in Tel Aviv and dates his prophecies between the years 592 and 570 BCE. The prophet appears as living with his countrymen among the community of deportees, Bedor HaGolah, but this is not enough to determine the time and place of the 48 chapters of the book, unless one believes the entire work to be written by a single author to be identified with the implied speaker. Arguments for the Babylonian context of the book of Ezekiel have been developed by identifying features in the Hebrew text that are difficult to explain without Babylonian influence. The book has been found to permeate with lexical, cultural, and ideological features that are likely to depend on Mesopotamian, if not distinctly Babylonian, language, iconography, and religion. While some features, such as the plethora of Akkadian loanwords, can be explained as simple borrowing of contemporary vernacular, others are suggestive of the adaptation of knowledge that was not readily available for everyone in diaspora community, but had to be acquired by education. I mention only a few illustrative cases highlighted by recent scholarship. The vision of God leaving his temple in Ezekiel 10 and returning again in chapter 43 is another example of the divine alienation, divine reconciliation pattern that is well known from Mesopotamian sources from different times, as has been pointed out by Daniel Bloch. The inaugural vision in Ezekiel 1 contains so many motifs known from Mesopotamian iconography that it is likely to presuppose knowledge of Mesopotamian cosmology, astronomy, and theology, as argued by Christoph Uehlinger and Maggie Odell. The pairing of 150 and 40 days in Ezekiel's symbolic act of lying on his left and right sides to mark the impending siege of Jerusalem in Ezekiel 4, according to the Septuagint, can be explained by the figuration of totality in Mesopotamian mathematics, as argued by Avi Winitzer. Moreover, the book shows familiarity with Mesopotamian texts. Motifs peculiar to Ezekiel can be found in comparable usages in the 8th century BCE Babylonian poem of Erra, found out by Daniel Body. Intended allusions to Gilgamesh epic have been found especially in the oracles against Tyre, where the highly enigmatic expression Tuppecha unekavecha may reflect the initial words of Gilgamesh. Avi Winitzer again. The architecture of the Temple of Jerusalem, as described in the vision of the concluding chapters, has been found well comparable to the available evidence of Neo-Babylonian temples by Tova Gansel and Shalom Holtz. Such a wide array of features indicating Babylonian influence means that the book of Ezekiel could only have been written in an environment where the adaptation of all these linguistic, iconographic, literary, and theological motives was possible. This admittedly does not absolutely locate the book of Ezekiel in Babylonia. The literati in Jerusalem and in Neo-Babylonian and Persian times may have been well enough connected with the dominant imperial culture to learn such Babylonianisms even in Jerusalem. Perhaps those Judeans who returned from the exile from the late 6th century on brought this knowledge with them to the old country, as some colleagues have been arguing. In the absence of conclusive evidence of such returnees, even this theory remains speculative. In any case, the Book of Ezekiel is a text that explicitly constructs an identity of displaced people from the early 6th century onwards, whether in Babylonia or in Jerusalem. The strong preference of the displaced for those who remained in the old country may point more strongly towards a Babylonian than a Jerusalemite standpoint. The Babylonian perspective is not eclipsed by the possibility that significant part of the book were written in the Persian period, since communities of Judeans were demonstrably still there, while hard evidence of the returnees is enigmatic at the best. Importantly, we know that there were Judeans in Babylonia. The Palace Archive of Nebuchadnezzar II includes texts concerning the distribution of sesame oil to certain groups and individuals, often of foreign origin, such as Philistia, Phoenicia, Elam, Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, and Judah. Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and his 5 sons are mentioned among the recipients of oil rations. Another group of 8 Judeans is mentioned in the ration lists, and the Palace Archive knows Judean courtiers, Sharesh Sharri, and other persons with Yahwistic names. A fair number of individuals with Yahwistic names are known from the documents belonging to the Murashu Archive, mostly subsistence farmers cultivating modest plots of land. Some of them had even larger holdings, indicating a somewhat higher socio-economic position. The most recent corpus of Babylonian cuneiform documents consists of more than 200 unprovenanced tablets, originally deriving from places called Beit Nashar, Beit Abiram, and Al Yahudu. These places are situated somewhere in the countryside near the city of Nippur. The Judeans appear predominantly as subsistence farmers, not occupying higher level positions of the society, since they were not free to alienate their landholdings. A few Judeans, however, are attested as officials, and 2 individuals stand out because of their long-term economical activity and independent businesses. Apart from those belonging to King Jehoiakim's entourage, most Judeans seem to have lived in the countryside. There were Judeans who were in constant interaction with people from the urban upper class, but they didn't seem to belong to the same social circles. The Judeans used the services of Babylonian scribes, but were not otherwise engaged in their social networks. There are no sources mentioning the education of the Judeans in Babylonia, but since a number of alphabetic scribes, Sepiru, with Judean names are known from cuneiform sources, it seems that even Judeans could serve in positions that required administrative literacy. The Book of Ezekiel, however, is a powerful witness of the utilization of highly developed scribal skills, not just of basic literacy, but of the production of literature of high linguistic, stylistic, and theological sophistication. The big question is, where and among whom did the Hebrew scribal culture survive? Jerusalem, of course, is a possible answer, since it is unlikely that scribal culture in its entirety moved from Judah to Babylonia after the destruction of Jerusalem. But if any part of the Book of Ezekiel actually originates from Babylonia, there must have been a social space that endorsed such activity, fulfilling at least a considerable minimum of permanent material and educational requirements. To all appearances, the Judean deportees, at least those belonging to the first wave in 597 BCE, consisted for a large part of the elite. The literati were certainly among this elite, and even though they could no longer enjoy their elite position as before, it would be strange if the displacement caused their interest in education and scribal learning to cease altogether, if there was even a limited possibility of continuing such learned enterprises. Our sources thus open 2 windows. dividing the view into two disconnected landscapes: the bureaucratic view on everyday life in rural Babylonia in cuneiform documents, and the scribal vision of the theological world of the book of Ezekiel with little interest in mundane businesses. These parallel worlds hardly communicate with each other, and it is difficult to know to what extent their creators were even aware of each other. The division of sources may reflect a split in rural and urban communities of Judeans, the former appearing in the cuneiform documents and the latter as the implied audience of Ezekiel. All this is speculation, but the very existence of the book of Ezekiel nevertheless testifies to a continuous scribal activity going on somewhere, perhaps in a more urban context, without leaving a trace in the haphazard administrative record that has ended up in our hands. The cuneiform documents testify to a significant degree of integration of the Judean population in the Babylonian society, even though the intensity of the interaction of the rural Judeans with other groups should not be overestimated. Even the book of Ezekiel, with its allusions to Mesopotamian learned traditions, can be seen as an example of a high degree of acculturation, but its sociocultural location remains a riddle that can be solved only with a great deal of speculation. Whatever the solution, the book of Ezekiel can be read as a document of an explicit identity construction of a group that actively recreates itself in diaspora circumstances brought about by imperial policy. As such, the book of Ezekiel is unique among written sources from any part of the ancient Near East. The book of Ezekiel can be read as an example of the survival strategy of a group that distinguishes itself from others by way of self-re-identification. I'm adapting this term from Dalit Romshiloni. Self-re-identification. The need for the renewed negotiation of the group identity is caused by the break with the past identity bound up with Jerusalem. The two Babylonian invasions meant more than just displacement. They first made a model of social structures and eventually put an end to temple worship. Jerusalem was still there, but after 586 BCE, Judean kingship was no more, the temple was gone, and the maintenance of the symbolic world of the community was seriously disturbed. The in-group of the book of Ezekiel is identified in the text as Israel, or the house of Israel. But who are the people behind this designation, and who should be identified as the out-group against which the in-group demarcates itself? These questions are intertwined with the overall theory of the emergence of the book of Ezekiel, which increases the risk of circular reasoning. A synchronic reading reckons with a single place and a short period of time, while a diachronic reading may point towards different temporal and geographical contexts. In the textual world, the in-group, the true house of Israel, identifies itself as continuing the covenantal relationship with God in Babylonia. However, such an ideological rather than socio-political entity is difficult to convert to a historical group, time, or place, especially if the text is the result of a long process of transmission. As to the identification of the out-group, one could easily think about the surrounding Babylonian society and its representatives, but this is not the case. The book of Ezekiel exhibits no interest in the Babylonian physical, cultural, or religious environment. No concrete circumstances in the land of the Chaldeans are described, no places mentioned except for Tel Aviv, no Babylonian people referred to except King Nebuchadnezzar. Even the long cycle of oracles against nations in Ezekiel 25 through 32 leaves Babylonia untouched. This, in the words of Casey Strine, indicates an insular ethnocentric attitude which virtually ignores the real world around the discourse. This does not necessarily imply an isolated historical context, however. The ignorance of the real world is a textual strategy, shifting the emphasis from the historical to the ideological world. The out-group thus clearly consists of other Judeans. But which Judeans? The Judean population was since the beginning of the 6th century split into the majority that survived as a post-collapse society in Judah and the minority that was resettled in Babylonia. Despite the common discourse of the exiles as a single group with shared identity and experiences, the Judean population in Babylonia was hardly a homogeneous group. It was brought there in 2 or more waves, which may have caused internal tensions among the Judean communities. It may also be that only the people belonging to the king's entourage ended up as urban dwellers, while the majority of the first group and all the subsequently deported were settled in the countryside. Hence, there may have been an urban-rural divide among Judeans located in Babylon. The outgroup of Ezekiel thus may not be a homogeneous entity either. It explicitly includes the population that remained in Judah after 597, but since the decisive criterion of the outgroup is its illegitimacy in the eyes of the in-group, the outgroup does not need to be bound to one place or time. If the book of Ezekiel has little to say about the life of the Judeans in Babylonia, it is not a bit more interested in anything that is really happening in Jerusalem and Judah. Obscuring social realities is due to the focus on Jerusalem, which is neither nostalgic nor realistic, but ideological and expressly negative. It emerges from the social-religious situation, which is less motivated by the minority position of a certain group in the Babylonian society than by the trauma caused by the loss of identity and the need of constructing a new one by theological means. The explanation of the displacement is fully theological. Now, returning to the problems I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation regarding identity and minority, let us take a look at how the book of Ezekiel might help us to cope with the difficulty of recognizing ethnicities, quote unquote, and identities in ancient Mesopotamia. The book of Ezekiel is a rare specimen of scribal activity of a non-dominant population group in the Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires. Despite all the problems related to the date, location, and transmission of the text of Ezekiel, it is undeniably an ancient text connected to a historical minority group, the diaspora status of which is its main topic. The reason for the existence of the minority group appearing in the book of Ezekiel is forced migration. The book wouldn't exist without the Babylonian invasions and eventual destruction of Jerusalem. It documents an important and otherwise poorly known aspect of the forced migration policy of Mesopotamian empires, that is, the perspective of a minority group coping with the consequences of the imperial policy, probably in the Babylonian context of the Neo-Babylonian and also Persian period. The book of Ezekiel documents an intense and enduring attempt of reconstructing the identity of a dislocated group of people. The perspective is manifestly emic, and the group is self-identified. Israel and other designations are not imposed on the group by the authorities of the dominant group, who, nota bene, did know to name a settlement al-Yahudu, recognizing the Judeans as a separate group, but they serve as tools of the group's own self-re-identification. The new identity is self-proclaimed and divinely authorized by God's word mediated by the prophet Ezekiel. The identity of the in-group of the book of Ezekiel is origin-based, indicating a strictly defined so-called ethnicity based on common God, ancestry, and geographical origin rather than a nation-state. Judah, denoting a political entity, is not used as the designation of the in-group. The Judeans were identified as a specific group by the Babylonian society, but this identification may not exactly correspond with the self-identification of Israel in the book of Ezekiel. The criteria of belonging to the in-group may not have been shared by all Judeans either, Hence, the book of Ezekiel cannot be used as evidence of a fixed, stable, and universally shared identity of the Judeans. On the contrary, it creates and constructs a deep inner Judean antagonism between Ezekiel's in-group in Babylonia and the delegitimized out-group. The book of Ezekiel, therefore, does not tell a lot about the status and integration of the Judean minority in the Babylonian society, but primarily about conflicts within Judeans themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marty, for this fascinating look at Ezekiel as a kind of like a testimony of one group and the way that it was affected by the Babylonian Empire that has survived in this fascinating way. Thank you so much. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Eckhart Fromm, Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale University and faculty affiliate of the Anthropology Division with responsibility for research on cuneiform tablets at the Yale Peabody Museum. Please take it away.
Thank you, Manfred. It's a privilege to participate in this inspiring event. Bear with me for a second. I will try to share my PowerPoint. Let me know if it doesn't work, please. Okay. Until the mid-19th century, Western views of ancient Mesopotamia were entirely dependent on two sets of sources: accounts provided by Greek and Roman historians, and more crucially still, texts included in the Hebrew Bible. Assyria featured prominently in both traditions, as the first empire in the former, and as a major opponent of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the latter. But a non-mediated access to the world of ancient Assyria was nowhere to be found. The archaeological exploration in the 1840s and 1850s of the Neo-Assyrian cities of Nineveh, Nimrud, and Khosavat, and the subsequent decipherment of the cuneiform texts discovered there, dramatically changed the way Assyrian was perceived. Initially, the Hebrew and Greco-Roman accounts remained important resources for historians of ancient Mesopotamia. But as more and more cuneiform texts were read and translated, those texts began to dominate modern attempts to reconstruct Assyrian history and culture, up to a point where the non-Assyrian sources played almost no role anymore. This development is hardly surprising. Palaces and temples in the Assyrian capitals, and eventually also at other sites, produced thousands of Assyrian royal inscriptions, some of them much longer than even the most extensive comparable texts from the classical world, the Res Gestae of the Roman Emperor Augustus. The amount of detail offered by them, especially on military campaigns, political maneuvering, and construction work, is nothing but astonishing. Another boon for modern historians was that the main addressees of the inscriptions were later kings, for this meant that the events recorded were described with a great deal of explicitness. Texts such as the Assyrian Eponym Chronicle made it, moreover, possible to create a highly accurate timeline for the events in question, and wall reliefs in Assyrian palaces provided impressive pictorial representations of many of the episodes described in the inscriptions. Compared to this embarrassment of historiographic riches, the information about ancient Assyria found in the works of classical authors in the Hebrew Bible was increasingly perceived as both modest and flawed. The Greek historians had invented a host of Assyrian kings from scratch and often looked at Assyrian history through the lenses of orientalizing stereotypes. The Bible mixed accurate data, for example, about the tribute delivered by Hezekiah to the Assyrian king Sennacherib, with plainly incorrect claims, such as the one in the book of Jonah about the 3-day journey that it allegedly took to walk across the city of Nineveh. As work on the redaction history of the Bible progressed, it became, moreover, increasingly clear that much of what the Bible had to say about Assyria had been written long after the downfall of the Assyrian Empire in response to specific theological agendas of later times. In view of such shortcomings, archaeologists felt little inclination to use the Bible for the assessment of the history of Assyria, whereas scholars of the biblical world would regularly draw on Assyrian texts to reconstruct the history of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. From early on, archaeologists like Albert Olmsted realized, of course, that Assyrian royal inscriptions were not objective accounts either, that they did not describe wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it had actually been, to quote the unachievable historiographical ideal articulated by the 19th century German historian Leopold von Ranke. Despite their amazing sense or detail, they were heavily biased, their main purpose being to celebrate the achievements of the kings who commissioned them. Ashurnasirpal II sets the tone when boasting in one of his inscriptions, I'm king, I'm lord, I'm praiseworthy, I'm exalted, I'm important, I'm magnificent, I'm foremost, I'm a hero, I'm a warrior, I'm a lion, and I am a man. A ruler so engrossed with himself and so full of toxic masculinity would gloss over defeats and mishaps hardly comes as a surprise. To balance such one-sidedness, archaeologists used a variety of additional sources, most notably the more than 2,000 cuneiform letters exchanged between Neo-Assyrian kings and an army of agents, provincial governors, military officials, and other correspondents. Such letters were usually written in response to specific challenges and thus revealed moments in which the normally well-oiled cogs of the Assyrian state machinery came to a grinding halt. Unlike the royal annals, their letters clustered around rather limited time periods, and they were often frustratingly fragmentary, linguistically challenging, and non-explicit. But despite such difficulties, historians were able to draw on them, at least to a certain extent, as a corrective to the failure-averse picture painted by the royal inscriptions. Both Assyrian royal inscriptions and Assyrian letters provide a great deal of information on the opposition Assyrian kings faced. The inscriptions talk at length about anti-Assyrian provocations by enemy rulers and the rebellions and revolts of client kings, referencing, for example, in considerable detail, the resistance the kingdoms of Israel and Judah put up in the last third of the 8th century against Assyrian attempts at imperial domination. Of course, all this opposition, the inscriptions claim, would eventually be crushed. Assyrian letters deal with external threats as well, but also, especially for the reign of the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, with insurrections from within Assyria. Several conspiracies directed against Esarhaddon in the late 670s by members of his inner circle are known in remarkable detail from intelligence reports from this time. Assyrian oracle queries to the sun god, and even more importantly, royal succession treaties, cover a wide variety of hypothetical insurrection scenarios, both within and without Assyria. It cannot be denied then that the available Assyrian sources provide a remarkably variegated and colorful picture of late Assyrian history. But we are also missing certain things. The political opinions of common folks, for example, remain largely opaque to us. And only rarely do we have the opportunity to listen to the enemies of the Assyrian kings and to the victims of Assyria's military expansion in their own voices. To be sure, we sometimes do find those voices quoted in Assyrian records. Ashurbanipal, for example, claims that his Elamite arch enemy Teoman had revealed his aggressive impulses when bragging, quote, I will not rest until I have dined in the midst of Nineveh, the Assyrian capital at the time. Letters written to Assyrian kings provide occasional glimpses into the minds of political opponents, including domestic ones, as well. A famous example is a letter from Haran that charges a female prophet in the service of a group of rebels of having proclaimed, speaking on behalf of the god Nusku, the kingship is for Sarsi. I will destroy the name and seed of Sennacherib. But let us not be mistaken. The authenticity of such quotes is often dubious. Teoman did hardly make statements in Neo-Assyrian, as is implied in Ashurbanipal's text, and the words he allegedly uttered might have been placed into his mouth by Ashurbanipal's scribes as a rather dark joke. After all, Teoman did eventually participate in a dinner at Nineveh, but only in the form of his head hanging from a tree under which Ashurbanipal and his wife enjoyed their own private banquet. And whether the slave girl in Haran had really spoken the words the author of the denunciation letter cited must remain forever uncertain. We do have a few Assyrian texts that seem to engage in more elaborate attempts to question discourses of royalty, as Jennifer Finn puts it in a recent monograph. One of them, known to modern scholars as the Sin of Sargon, seeks to explain the violent deaths of the Assyrian kings Sargon II and Sennacherib, to which we will come back, by arguing that they had both failed, each in his own way, to establish an appropriate balance of power between the Assyrian god Ashur and the Babylonian god Marduk. Challenging the religious ideologies of these two rulers, the text can indeed be considered an example of counter-discursiveness within Assyria. Another composition, the Netherworld Vision of an Assyrian Prince, seems to criticize members of the Assyrian royal house as well, even though it remains uncertain whom exactly. What is clear, though, is that neither the Sin of Sargon nor the Netherworld Vision can be regarded as testimonies of a radical opposition to Assyrian rule as such. They rather represent discourses within small circles of the Assyrian elite about the legitimate or illegitimate political claims of specific individuals and their political and religious agendas. To summarize then, Assyrian cuneiform texts do provide us with information about opposition to the rule of specific Assyrian kings and Assyria in general, but this information is limited and filtered. Almost all of it comes to us through channels that are pro-government and therefore highly biased. What about testimonies related to opposition to Assyria from the edges of the Assyrian Empire and from the mouths of the opponents themselves? We would expect to have such professions of anti-Assyrian sentiment, especially from Babylonia, with its rich culture of writing on clay tablets. But what we get from there is actually rather disappointing. State archives like those found at Calach and Nineveh have not been uncovered in Babylonia. A letter in which the 12th century Babylonian king Adad-Shuma-Utsur calls the Assyrian rulers Ashurnirari III and Ili-Pada drunkards is from before the Neo-Assyrian period, and a denigrating letter written by Nabopolassar to the last Assyrian king, Sin-Sharu-Ishkun, is a rare exception known to us only because it was handed down to later generations by Babylonian scholars. Babylonian wall inscriptions tend to focus on temple building and other cultic and religious matters, and are therefore not terribly helpful either, even though the inscriptions of Marduk-Apollodonar II, Nabopolassar, and Nabonidus do include a few anti-Assyrian remarks. The same applies to the corpus of inscriptions in hieroglyphic Luwian and Aramaic from Anatolia and northern Syria, and the royal inscriptions in cuneiform from Urartu, whose references to successful campaigns against Assyria are all very brief. An interesting case is that of ancient Egypt, a land that, starting in 671 BCE, was for some 15 years under Assyrian rule. No contemporary inscriptions or other contemporary texts from Egypt are known to have dealt with this humiliating episode, but its traumatic effects can be gauged from the so-called Inaros cycle, a series of semi-literary texts in Demotic that describe in considerable detail the Egyptian fights against the Assyrian invaders and the eventual defeat of the latter. The relevant papyri are from the Roman period, and much in the stories they tell is completely fantastic, but the names of their protagonists, Sargon, Sennacherib, and several 7th century pharaohs, leave no doubt that at least some of their features must go back to much earlier times, closer to the events the texts describe. It seems the Inaros cycle presents the Assyrian king repeatedly in embarrassing circumstances, for example, in his bedchamber, but the poor preservation of the material makes it hard to accurately establish the plot lines of the texts. This brings us finally to the Hebrew Bible. Unlike the non-Assyrian sources from Babylonia, Syria, and Anatolia, the Bible talks about Assyria at considerable length and in a variety of genres. And unlike the demotic stories from Egypt, it provides texts that are cohesive and complete. These qualities suggest that no source might be better suited than the Bible to answer the question that Peter Machinist in 1983 phrased as follows: what did the Assyrian Empire look like to others, especially its contemporaries? The biblical texts are remarkably ambivalent in their judgment of what the best course of action might be for the kings of Israel and Judah to deal with the threat posed by Assyria. We do not only find tales of heroic resistance, but also pleas for a realpolitik aiming at self-preservation, which required accommodation and compromise with the imperial aggressor. Such complex political reasoning could be taken as a sign that much of what the Bible has to say about Assyria does indeed reflect discourses in which Israelite and Judahite contemporaries of the late Assyrian rulers were engaged. At the same time, stories like the one about the angel of the Lord striking down in one night 185,000 Assyrian troops in their camp, thus 2 Kings 19:35, show that the biblical accounts about Assyria also include a lot of historical fiction, most likely produced in much later times. To lay bare the sources and earliest versions of the texts found in the Hebrew Bible has been a main preoccupation of biblical scholarship in the past 150 years, and even though a consensus on these matters remains largely elusive, it does seem possible to identify certain segments within the Bible that reflect more accurately than others how specific groups in Israel and Judah perceived Assyria during the 8th and 7th centuries. As mentioned before, not all of the relevant texts can be considered composition literature, to reference the title of my lecture. But some, I think, do reflect the attitudes of those who loathed the Assyrian occupation and reveal the rhetorical strategies they used to fight it. In the following, I will briefly discuss pertinent examples from 3 biblical books, all of them well known, but perhaps not yet fully explored from the point of view from which I would like to look at them here. The first case study is the famous mocking dirge in Isaiah 14. Was directed, according to the text, against the king of Babel, thus Isaiah 14:3. Most scholars assume that its original target was Sargon II of Assyria. The reason for this identification is the description provided by Isaiah of the circumstances of the king's death, a quote glossing over certain translation issues. All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb, but you are cast out away from your grave like loathsome carrion, clothed with the dead, those pierced by the sword. The Assyrian Eponym Chronicle and the aforementioned text about the sin of Sargon reveal that Sargon II, while on campaign in Tabal in 705 BCE, had been killed in action, and that the Assyrians had failed to recover his body, a parallel so closely in line with the Isaiah description that, despite the misgivings of some scholars, it can hardly be considered coincidental. Isaiah 14 highlights, through a series of elaborate metaphors, the chasm between the enemy king's, quite literally, lofty ambitions and military exploits on one hand, and his sad end on the other. Here are some characteristic verses. How the oppressor has ceased, how his insolence has ceased. The cypresses exult over you, the cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no one comes to cut us down. Maggots are the bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How we are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How we are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. A passage later famously applied to Satan. You said in your heart, I will descend to heaven and make myself like the Most High. For Isaiah, we learn from these lines, the death of Sargon was reason for great rejoicing. However irresistible the Assyrian war machine might seem, in the end it would break down and the Israelites would be free again. The last lines of the dirge are an open invitation to raise arms against the oppressor. May the descendants of evildoers never more be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their father. Let them never rise to possess the earth or cover the face of the world with cities. As is well established, Sargon's death was in fact followed by a massive rebellion in the west, one in which Hezekiah of Judah participated in a leading capacity. That anti-Assyrian propaganda pieces like Isaiah's mocking dirge might have played a role in inciting the rebels is not at all unfeasible. The book of Isaiah also includes a remarkably well-informed description of the murder of Sargon's successor Sennacherib by 2 of his sons. Quote, then King Sennacherib of Syria left Judah, went home, and lived at Nineveh. As he was worshipping in the house of his god Nisroch, possibly Nusku, his sons Adramelech, that is Urdamolissi, and Sharetzer, that is Sharu-Utsur, killed him with a sword and escaped into the land of Ararat, that is Urartu. His son Esarhaddon succeeded him. The death of Assyrian kings, the subject barely touched upon in Assyrian sources, were moments that revealed that despite its enormous power, the Assyrian Empire was not invulnerable. This is why they are so prominently featured in the book of Isaiah. The violent end of Sennacherib, however, was not followed by another Judean rebellion. It was the example of Hezekiah, who had to pay a very high price for his insubordination, prompted his successor Manasseh to remain a faithful Assyrian client king. Biblical texts do not only seek to tarnish the image of specific Assyrian rulers, some also disparage the Assyrian state and its imperial ideology as a whole. Our second case study, the book of Nahum, is such a text. Rather than focusing on individual kings, the book presents a vision, Hebrew chazon, concerning the city of Nineveh, Assyria's capital, which stands for everything that is despicable about Assyria. Ah, city of bloodshed, utterly deceitful, full of booty, no end to the plunder, horsemen charging, flashing sword and glittering spear, piles of dead heaps of corpses. Because of the countless debaucheries of the prostitute, gracefully alluring mistress of sorcery, who enslaves nations through her debaucheries and peoples through her sorcery, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will let nations look on your nakedness and kingdoms on your shame. Despite the fact that the Book of Nahum is an oracle professing to refer to events in the future, scholars almost unanimously assume that it was written after Nineveh's destruction by Babylonian and Median troops in 612 BCE. Even so, it may be possible to infer from it what at least some people in Judah thought about Assyria prior to the empire's collapse. In the quoted passage, Nahum uses a whole range of sexual metaphors to denigrate the Assyrian capitals. He may have done so in an attempt to polemically allude to Nineveh's main deity, Ishtar, who was the patroness of war and love and a notoriously sex-craved goddess. Such venomous verbal attacks on Nineveh's sacred rites and religious law require some acquaintance with the latter and may have circulated in a place like Judah even before Nineveh fell. That they were generated centuries after the events in question seems quite unlikely. An even more radical but also more indirect critique of Assyrian statehood might be found in the biblical book of Deuteronomy. Assyria is nowhere mentioned explicitly in this book, which is set in the time of Moses. But scholars have argued for a long time that an early version of Deuteronomy may have been produced in the 7th century BCE in response to Judean encounters with Assyrian succession treaties, which, as recently confirmed by the find of an Assyrian treaty manuscript at Tel Tainat on the Orontes River, were indeed sent to locations all over the Levant. The treaties, to be affirmed by elaborate oaths, were meant to secure the unconditional loyalty of both Assyrians and Assyrian vassals towards the Assyrian reigning king and his heir apparent. It has been shown that central portions of Deuteronomy follow in their structure, and to some extent the provisions they include, the Assyrian succession treaties, but invert their core message. Rather than requesting that loyalty be shown to the king, Deuteronomy argues that it is owed exclusively to God. A particularly intriguing passage is in Deuteronomy 17 puts in place severe limitations on royal power. I quote, "You may indeed set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. One of your own community you may set as king over you. You are not permitted to put a foreigner over you, who is not of your own community. Even so, he must not acquire many horses for himself, and he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. When he has taken the throne of his kingdom, he shall have a copy of this law written for him in the presence of the Levitical priests. So he will be neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment." According to the text, the kingship upon which the restrictions described here were imposed was that of the promised land, Israel. The actual addressee of the passage, however, might have been the Judean king Josiah, during whose reign a book of law, presumably an early version of Deuteronomy, was allegedly found, but in fact probably composed in the temple. It may be that during the last decades of the 7th century BCE, members of Jerusalem's leading religious circles wanted to rein in Josiah's authority perhaps because of their dissatisfaction with certain missteps by Josiah's long-ruling predecessor Manasseh. But it is also feasible that it was their early experience of the absolute power claimed by the Assyrian kings that is behind the clauses just quoted. Remember, the Assyrians had taken horses and chariot troops from Samaria in 722 and royal women, silver and gold from Judah in 701. An imperial regime like that of Assyria, with its trappings of military might, a large royal harem, and unfettered legal authority on the part of the king, was never to be implemented again. Here, then, we encounter a truly revolutionary critique of an all-encompassing form of kingship, a critique that puts into question the whole notion of this type of government, whether exercised by an Assyrian ruler or by a ruler of some other state, including Judah itself. I hope the 3 case studies presented in this talk have provided you with an idea of how the imperial periphery wrote back in the face of an Assyrian expansion that many people in 8th and 7th century Western Asia must have considered inexorable and unstoppable. My remarks have been quite general, somewhat superficial, and too often interspersed with weasel words like perhaps, possibly, and some scholars believe. But I hope to have shown that the Hebrew Bible does seem to provide insights, probably more than any other source, into the views of those who oppose Assyria's imperial mission, that it allows us to listen to some extent to the voices of the conquered and colonized. One does not have to be a faithful disciple of the post-colonial studies movement of the past decades to acknowledge that this is important. Without it, one can do little more than write a history of the victors. For a long time, Assyriology was considered one of the Ancile Theologiae, the handmaidens of theology. I do not advocate for a reversal of this relationship with Hebrew Bible studies serving as the Ancilla Assyriologiae. But it would be nice if the 2 disciplines could coexist in the future in a spirit of mutual respect and equal intellectual partnership. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for that. And we have now gotten a sort of programmatic declaration that we will continue to debate after our final speaker and the respondents that we're going to be hearing. So the final main speaker today is Jesse DeGrado, Assistant Professor of Ancient Middle East Studies at the University of Michigan. Please.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna just set up my slides here. Give me a second. All right. First, I want to say thank you to Jeff, Sarah, and Ranford for organizing this conference. I also want to thank my fellow panelists for the opportunity for dialogue and offer a hearty thanks to all of you who are braving Zoom fatigue this late in the semester to join us. Recently, Assyriologists and biblicists alike have expressed a growing interest in reading the Hebrew Bible as resistance literature. In this context, studies tend to frame the biblical texts as subversive responses that oppose Assyrian imperialism. Opposition is certainly one response attested in the Bible, as Eckhart Fromm has just highlighted for us. The Hebrew Bible also contains a much broader spectrum of engagement with Assyria, though. This literature can shed light on military praxis and responses to propaganda from the periphery of empire. In my talk today, I will feature one example, which is drawn from my current book project, Authoring Empire, Assyria, Judah, and the Dynamics of an Imperial Exchange. In my book, I argue that Assyria has emerged as a prototypical evil empire in contemporary discourse. Implicitly drawing on 19th and 20th century models of empire, scholars of biblical interaction with Assyria have produced a layered and shifting portrait cobbled together from our own imperial anxieties. Ironically, the uncritical application of post-colonial theory to biblical texts can actually reinforce Orientalist stereotypes of Assyria as the Oriental despot. As a result, Any engagement with Assyria in the Hebrew Bible tends to be reflexively assimilated to the paradigm of anti-imperial resistance literature. My broader project articulates a new approach to studying biblical engagement with Assyria. I engage post-colonial theory, including Homi Bhabha's notion of cultural hybridity, but crucially, I do this with attention to historical variation in imperial techniques and goals. Ultimately, I think this will lead to a richer understanding of the corpus of texts preserved in the Bible. More important for us today, the work will paint a fuller picture of how people at the edge of empire responded to Assyrian hegemony. Today, I will focus on Isaiah 10, 5-11, which presents the thoughts of an imagined Assyrian king. I argue that the passage contributes to our understanding of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in two ways. First, the passage preserves historical details about the Hamat-led rebellion of 720 BCE. Second, it contains an innovative response to the Assyrian practice of cultic despoliation. Given the poor state of preservation of Sargon's annals, the biblical account of the events surrounding the Hamat rebellion becomes even more significant. Isaiah 10, 8-10 lists Kulania, located at Tel Tainat, alongside other conspirators in the 720 rebellion. This reference can be considered alongside the recent discovery of a Sargon stela at Tainat itself and the broader historical connections between Hamat, Arpad, and Kulania. Taken together, the evidence suggests that Kulania was among the cities that joined the ill-fated Hamat rebellion. In addition to providing granular historical details like this, Isaiah 10 also furnishes scholars with a local response to the practice and propaganda surrounding godnapping. In the second half of the talk, I will consider how Isaiah 10 reflects Sargon's despoiling of divine images from Samaria in 720 BCE. I argue that the passage introduces a subtle critique of cultic statues due to their vulnerability to capture and political manipulation. Thus, we should not conceptualize aniconism as a native feature of Israelite or Judean religion that was marshaled in opposition to Assyria. Rather, aniconism is a discourse that was born of cultural hybridity and imperial entanglements. Let's begin. In Isaiah 10, 5-11, an unnamed Assyrian king stands poised to invade Judah. The passage opens with divine address that is directed at the Assyrian king himself. O Assyria, my raging staff and furious rod is in their hand. Against a godless nation I send him, against the people who have enraged me I command him, to take spoil and to seize plunder and to trample it like the muck of the streets. This he does not understand, and his mind does not comprehend, for he intends to destroy and to cut down nations not few. Indeed, he says, are not all my commanders kings? Was not Kulania like Carchemish? Was not Hamat like Arpad? Was not Samaria like Damascus, when I snatched the worthless kingdoms and their statues? Shall I not do to Judah and its icons, as I did to Samaria and its worthless images? As other scholars, including prominently Peter Machinist, have noted, the engagement with Assyria in these verses extends beyond the form of divine address and royal response. The author of the passage also directly mimics and transforms motifs common in Assyrian royal inscriptions. Before delving into the ideological implications of this engagement, I want to focus on the historical setting of the oracle and what its contents can reveal about the fall of Samaria to Sargon. The biblical text offers corroboration for a claim that Sargon himself makes in the Nimrod prisons, namely that he despoiled the gods of Israel when he conquered Samaria. And so Sargon claims the Sumerians, who had agreed together with a hostile king to me not to do service or bear tribute, made war. I fought with them and counted as spoil 27,280 people, as well as their chariots and the gods in whom they trusted. Coordinating this reference with Isaiah 10 should solve any debate about the historical accuracy of Sargon's claims of cultic despoliation in Samaria. Both Assyrian and Judean authors agree that Sargon removed divine statues from the capital of Israel. More interesting for our purposes today, the biblical text provides a concrete example of local responses to the Assyrian imperial practice. We will return to this matter shortly. First, however, I want to consider how Isaiah 10 can shed light on anti-Assyrian coalitions in the southern Levant. More specifically, the list of recently conquered territories in verses 9 to 10 can enrich our understanding of Sargon's Levantine campaigns in the year 720. 5 of the 6 kingdoms, or 720 to 717 BCE, I should say. 5 of the 6 kingdoms mentioned explicitly appear in Assyrian inscriptions detailing rebellions from this period. In fact, 4 of the kingdoms, Hamat, Arpad, Samaria, and Damascus, participated in the 720 uprising that resulted in the fall of Samaria. The 5th, Carchemish, rebelled and was reconquered 3 short years later. Based on the co-location of Kulania with these other toponyms, Nadav Naaman has suggested that this city too may have participated in the 720 rebellion. In support of this proposal, Sean Zelig Astor has adduced the recent discovery of a stela of Sargon at Tel Tainat, Kulania. The presence of a stela itself is not necessarily indicative of Assyrian conquest, as Lauinger notes in the Editio Princeps of the Tainat fragment. I argue, however, that several additional factors adjudicate in favor of Kulania's involvement in the revolt. These include the mention of Kulania alongside Arpad in the Beirut stela, and the broader historical relationship between Hamat and Kulania. First, the state of Unki, which is centered at Kulania, is mentioned alongside Beate Agusi, Arpad, in a broken passage that follows a description of the deportations at Hamat. So here we have the people of Hatti and Aram who dwell in Beate Agusi and Unki to its full extent, a break at the beginning of line 20, and then possibly the words Yaubidi. So here I am following Naaman's suggestion for reading these final signs of line 20 and reconstructing the name Yaubidi, the king of Hamat, who organized the 720 rebellion. Thus, we have the land of Unki with its capital at Kulania listed alongside Beate Agusi, who was a co-conspirator in the rebellion. Let's take a closer look at this broken final line. As you can see here, the reading is consistent with the traces visible in both the photograph and the hand copy prepared by Hopkins in the Editio Princeps. Although Hopkins' copy preserves only 2 verticals for the sign U2, the 3rd middle vertical is clearly visible on the photograph, as are both left horizontals and the upper of the 2 horizontals at right. In addition, there is room in the effaced area of line 20 for 4 or 5 signs, perhaps something to the effect of Sha'ana Idi. Thus, line 20 and following might refer to the land of Kulania as among those who went to the assistance of Yaubidi. This would be consistent, again, with the grouping of Kulania and Arpad in the first half of the clause. Also significant is the close political connection between the kingdoms of Unki and Hamat throughout the 9th and 8th centuries. During the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, these 2 vassal states, along with the smaller cities of Tsimira and Hatarika, launched a failed rebellion that resulted in their conversion into provinces. All of these cities appear once again in the context of the Hamat-led 720 rebellion, either explicitly listed as co-conspirators or as sites at which victory stelae were erected. To conclude this small foray into regional politics, the broken Beirut stela and broader historical context would not be sufficient alone to determine Kulania's participation in the Hamat rebellion of 720. In this instance, the biblical text provides an additional piece of evidence, allowing us more thoroughly to reconstruct the broad-based support Yaubidi garnered for his anti-Assyrian rebellion. In addition to reconstructing the granular events of 720 BCE, we can use Isaiah 10 to arrive at a fuller portrait of the impact of an Assyrian policy, despoiling cultic statuary, or more colloquially, godnapping. This policy was one component of a sophisticated program of propaganda aimed at manipulating a population into submission by engaging local mythologies and religious persuasions. Kogan contextualizes the practice within the motif of divine abandonment, common to religious literature in both Mesopotamia and the Levant. By deploying this theme, Assyrians argued that it was by the will of the local gods that they triumphed over a subject population. However, As Shane has demonstrated, the language and imagery employed in Assyrian depictions of godnapping is not a straightforward adaptation of divine abandonment. Because Assyrian kings recognized the divine status of the foreign gods they deported, they had to walk a fine line, using the statues as political pawns without incurring the wrath of the gods who inhabited them. In other words, the problem of godnapping creates a problem of divine versus royal agency. Do gods leave of their own accord, or are they kidnapped by the Assyrian army? Zaya focuses on the psychological implications of this conundrum for the Assyrian king. Here, I want to argue that the Assyrian propaganda actually productively engages this ambiguity in order to present local people with multiple paradigms for understanding their fate, all of which point to Assyrian supremacy. To see how this plays out, we're going to focus on just one text, Sargon's letter to the god Ashur. In describing how he sought divine approval for his actions, Sargon focuses attention in the realm of the gods. So he writes Ashur, the father of the gods, the lord of the lands, the king of the entirety of the heavens and the earth, who begat all, lord of lords, to whom Marduk, Enlil of the gods, granted in days of yore the gods of every hill and valley of the four quarters of the earth, that they might honor him without exception, and that he might bring them with their heaping treasures to a Horsagal Kurkura. This clause employs a series of epithets to present an audience scene ordained by Marduk at the beginning of time. The gods of all the world stream forth to pay homage to Ashur, bringing their tribute into his temple. Thus, while this is not a straightforward presentation of divine abandonment, the text offers a means for understanding the recent despoliation of the Urartian god Haldi. In this presentation of events, Haldi's trip to Assyria is undertaken at the will of the gods Ashur and Marduk, and it is presented as a peaceful procession. At other places in the letter, however, the Assyrian king interposes himself and his troops into Haldi's journey. Just 30 lines later, Sargon recounts, regarding the god Haldi, in whom the people of Urartu trusted, I gave the command to take him out. Victoriously, I seated him, that's Haldi, in front of his city gate, and I took captive his, that is the king's wife, his sons, his daughters, and his people, the descendants of his dynasty. Here, the immobility of Haldi's statue is emphasized as Sargon himself manipulates the image, placing it in front of the city gate and parading deportees before it. Following this pageantry, Sargon again assumes agency. He loads the god and other booty onto the backs of his soldiers for the trip back to Assyria. In both of these instances, the subject of the action is the Assyrian king, not the deity Haldi, whose perspective is omitted entirely from the account. Other accounts of deportation of divine images employ verbs that are even more forceful, such as shalalu, to despoil, nasahu, to tear away, and ekemu, to kidnap. Similarly, Assyrian reliefs show soldiers carrying statues away as booty in a way that calls into question the agency of captured deities. Rather than moving of their own accord, the statues are always transported by soldiers. We can survey a few of these here. So on this slide, you see a representation of a procession of 4 gods. These are carried away by Assyrian soldiers in a relief from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. A second scene, also from the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, depicts soldiers carrying off an anthropomorphic god at left and a stereomorphic bird statue as onlookers mourn and weep. The next 2 panels that we're looking at come from Sennacherib's southwest palace. In this image, at top left, you can see soldiers despoiling 2 gods who are seated on planks. And here, we can see the procession of at least 3 gods who are portrayed as small statues. This portrayal of kidnapped deities can be compared to depictions of Mesopotamian gods and their worshippers in contemporaneous art. When Assyrian gods are portrayed anthropomorphically, they are physically impressive, surrounded by radiance, riding on mythical beasts, or towering above their worshippers. This is apparent on small-scale representations, such as this Neo-Assyrian period cylinder seal. Similarly, we have an image of a god here standing elevated above his worshipper on a famous glazed orthostat from Ashur. And in Sennacherib's Bavian reliefs, a divine couple, most likely Ashur and Mulusu, ride mythical beasts that elevate them above even the supersized image of the king. The representation of Mesopotamian gods with their worshippers thus contrasts with the depiction of despoiled gods. The latter appear as small icons carried on the shoulders of humans. On Sennacherib's reliefs, this is further highlighted by the careful rendering of tiny platforms on which the statues were mounted. The literary formulations and iconographic portrayals thus show how Assyrian scribes employed the motif of divine abandonment while implicitly calling into question the agency of foreign gods. In other words, it presents the viewer with a series of questions. Does a god leave the city voluntarily or under duress? Are they a guest of Ashur, or are they Assyrian captives? Let's return now to the biblical text. Composed in the wake of Sargon's conquest of Samaria, Isaiah 10, 5-11 responds to both the practice of stealing gods and the accompanying ideology. In particular, it exploits this inherent ambiguity created by the Assyrian portrait of the practice. The passage does so by calling into question the efficacy of cultic statuary as markers of divine presence. This critique of iconic worship emerges from the lexical choices and paronomasia in verses 9-11. After rehearsing his conquests of the powerless kingdoms and their statues, the fictional Assyrian king demands, "Shall I not do to Jerusalem and its images as I did to Samaria and its worthless images?" The use of the lexeme elilim to denote divine images is significant here because it has a negative connotation, implying that these images are powerless. We will return to discuss this critique further in a moment. Before that, I want to situate the biblical response more broadly in the context of intercultural exchange. What I've outlined so far is a Judean response to Assyrian propaganda that rejects its analytic categories. To be clear, however, I do not think it is adequate to call this resistance literature and be done with it. This is for two reasons. First, we need to be precise about what is being resisted. In this case, it is specifically the Assyrian practice of god napping and its associated discourse. It may even be the Assyrian presence in the southern Levant. But, and this is a big caveat, it is not necessarily the case that the author of this text resists imperialism more generally. In fact, the majority of the biblical texts that oppose Mesopotamian empires nonetheless appropriate its broader imperial paradigm. Thus, resisting Assyria does not make a text anti-imperial. There's a second way in which Isaiah 10 complicates facile assumptions about the Bible as resistance literature. This text is among the earliest datable proponents of aniconism, and in fact, its critique of iconism is quite subtle. The author does not programmatically condemn the use of cultic statuary. Instead, they call into question its efficacy as a marker of divine presence. Thus, rather than constituting an assertion of native Judean religion or culture in opposition to Assyria, Isaiah 10 presents something new that is born of this imperial encounter. The idea of aniconism as a culturally hybrid discourse can be explored further with reference to Homi Bhabha's theory of colonial mimesis. Bhabha argues that European imperial powers authorized themselves through the representation of colonial subjects and the imposition of norms. Simultaneously, however, Bhabha maintains that this mimetic process is necessarily ambivalent and incomplete. The colonial subjects must never be conceived as equal to their rulers, lest they demand self-governance. Bhabha pithily sums this up as almost the same, but not quite. And in the case of modern European colonialism, there is of course the inevitable refrain, almost the same, but not white. The result is the construction of a fundamentally ambivalent discourse that, on the one hand, incorporates populations into an imperial system through the process of mimetic representation, and, on the other, must continually find ways to assert its power by articulating difference between the ruler and the ruled. This rhetorical characterization is not, however, in the exclusive control of the colonizer. Rather, mimicry likewise affords the subject population a rhetorical strategy for returning the colonizer's gaze and disrupting the discourse of imperial authority. Bhabha identifies the inherent ambivalence of colonial discourse the very construction of similarity and difference as its Achilles heel. Local populations can capitalize on this ambivalence, employing mimetic strategies in order to both appropriate aspects of colonial discourse and to reject its projection of authority. Bhabha's articulation of mimesis and mimicry was developed specifically with reference to British imperialism in India. In adapting this work, it is essential that we identify a significant difference between modern European colonialism and Assyrian imperialism. Unlike the British, Assyrian empire builders do not show an interest in imposing the empire's cultural or religious values on subject populations, and they are certainly not imposing the racialized categories we are familiar with from modern colonial discourse. And yet, although the context is very different, British and Assyrian propaganda do share a rhetorical goal. Both subsume conquered populations under an ideology that authorizes imperial control. In essence, both empires present populations to themselves in a way that instills in them correct behavior in a broader hegemonic system. The ambiguity surrounding the agency of the Assyrian king vis-a-vis conquered deities can thus be seen as a type of the mimetic ambivalence described by Bhabha. Literary representations of gods streaming to Ashur's temple, joyfully heaping tribute at his feet, create a cultural model for subject populations that presents Assyrian conquest as divinely ordained. A second strain of propaganda is more violent. It casts gods as plunder rather than as willing guests. Both narratives authorize Assyrian power by representing subjugated peoples, but they do so in a way that is fundamentally ambivalent. The image of captured gods voluntarily delivering their people to Assyrian rule projects an image of populations and their gods living in harmony with Assyria. Simultaneously, however, rhetorical techniques that highlight the power of the Assyrian king at the expense of local gods serve as a constant reminder of the violence inherent to this imperial rule. Let's return to the biblical text. Isaiah 10 responds to the Assyrian ideology of godnapping by transforming imperial claims through mimicry and mockery. This reformulation of Assyrian propaganda is effective precisely because it picks up on the ambivalence already present in Assyrian rhetoric. The fictional king's speech in verses 9 to 11, in particular, mimics Assyrian claims of royal agency. First, the extended rhetorical question implies that the king personally has prevailed over foreign nations and their cultic statuary. The speech reaches its climax in verse 11, when the monarch threatens to inflict upon Jerusalem and its statues what he has already done to Samaria and its worthless images. By amplifying the claims of royal agency found in Assyrian discourse, Isaiah 10, 5 to 11 resolves this ambivalence and constructs a caricature of an ignorant Assyrian king. In addition to addressing the problem of royal and divine agency, Isaiah 10 also contains an implicit critique of iconism. As noted already, this critique emerges through the lexical choices of the author, which emphasize both the impotence and the plastic nature of cultic statuaries. This emphasis creates a small caesura in the Assyrian narrative, which equates the fate of cult statues with the will of their resident deities. In response, Isaiah 10 undermines the reliability of cult images as markers of divine presence and absence. Furthermore, by placing the implicit critique of iconism in the mouth of the Assyrian king himself, the author of the text curtails the real Assyrian king's ability to speak for Judah and its God. The bombastic emphasis on royal power is consistent with the presentation of the king in Assyrian propaganda. However, by modifying the Assyrian position to cast doubt on the value of the statues, and not just the agency of the gods, the biblical author undermines its source. If the cult statues themselves are worthless as representatives of Yahweh, then Assyrian control over these objects has no significance, and the Assyrian king cannot speak for Israel or Judah's deity. Texts like Isaiah 10, 5 to 11 provide a window onto life at the edge of Assyrian empire. As Eckhart Fromm has pointed out for us, the Bible itself is a product of centuries of editing and transmission, and it must be engaged with attention to this complex textual history. Yet, when engaged critically, the Bible also offers a high-resolution image of the southern Levant under Assyrian rule. It thus has the potential to shed light on alliances and military activity that are otherwise inaccessible to contemporary scholars. Equally important, the Bible shows how specific Assyrian practices were received by local populations. Today, we have examined Samaria's spoils rather than, as the conference title suggested, Jehu's tribute. And in this case, the Bible quite literally offers Assyriologists a fine set of cultic statuary from Samaria. There's just one caveat. You can't ransom it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation and giving us a lot of material to think further with, leaving me with a lot of questions. I want to just give one announcement before I turn the word over, the floor or the screen over to our first respondent. We have a Q&A function in Zoom where you can type in a question. And now I invite everybody who is present who has a question, either for one of the speakers or for one of the respondents, to type in your questions. And I will try to address those after we have finished with the formal portion of the program. So please use that as you wish. And now I will introduce the first respondent, Julie DeLuti, Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at St. Joseph's University. Please.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers of this conference, and especially thank you to the speakers, both yesterday and today. It is wonderful to join you virtually and to consider anew what the study of the Hebrew Bible offers the field of Assyriology. For the presenters today, the answer to our overarching theme is multivalent and draws on different books of the Bible. In particular, the case studies all probe Judean texts as prisms of life under the Assyrian or Babylonian empires, and each paper examines a different angle on the status quo circumstances for at least one minority population. How does a text construct the identity of displaced people? What is the diaspora context for the textual representation of a group's place of origin? Who are the voices from the periphery? Can and how does a text resist? I will highlight briefly the contributions made in each of the papers, interspersed with questions to open our ensuing discussion this afternoon. In his paper, Martin Nissinen asserts that we can, quote, look at changing identities in Mesopotamia through a biblical lens, close quote. Using the book of Ezekiel as his locus of study, Marty maintains that we must first recognize that the texts of the Hebrew Bible reflect the changing nature of collective identity, not only of the contours of ancient Israel, but also of Mesopotamia. The question of how to live as a minority is inextricably linked to the construction of Judean identity over a long period of time, which is documented in the Bible. For the book of Ezekiel specifically, Marty argues that there is an intra-Judean tension among different social groups voicing different opinions on the matter. Against the backdrop of the localized Babylonian context for Ezekiel, he explores the reconstruction of a displaced group's identity as one answer. In doing so, Marty effectively notes the imprint of Babylonian influence on the book of Ezekiel, with particular attention to the language and ideology of the text. He also examines the available archival evidence to situate the presence of Judeans beyond the so-called exilic period. Marty directs our attention not only to Akkadian loanwords in Ezekiel and the book's familiarity with Mesopotamian literary sources, but also to Mesopotamian iconography found within the work. These motifs, whether linguistic or material, are our database. Yet Marty explains that groups in Mesopotamia have not left behind self-pronounced written documentation about themselves, and so parts of the Hebrew Bible, quote, serve as unique and indeed the only examples of texts composed by members of a minority group in Babylonia constructing its own identity, close quote. This is further defined as the people from the former kingdom of Judah, among whom include deportees after Nebuchadnezzar II's conquest. To that end, the identity construction of any diasporic group, whether ancient or modern, must also consider the overt or implicit link between a minority population and its real or imagined homeland. In the study of modern diasporas, there often is a pervasive interest and reckoning with the status of one's place of origin over consecutive generations, which we as readers confront and must grapple with. Where then should we locate Ezekiel 8, for example, the prophet's vision of Jerusalem, and then Ezekiel 40 to 42? Is this solely a theological construct, or rather part of the strategy of a minority community's self-re-identification under imperial rule to invoke Dalit Rom Shiloni? Perhaps multiple viewpoints are preserved here about Jerusalem and or Judah, and this is precisely the point, to engage the meaning of the homeland in a negotiation of the collective. To be sure, articulation of such group identity is faced with the realities of foreign domination. In a different iteration of the conference's thematic question, Eckhart Fromm asks how certain sections of the Hebrew Bible respond to this imperial control. In his paper, Eckhart reconsiders the query from the perspective of data available for writing the history of Assyria. While opposition to an anti-Assyrian sentiment against specific kings is communicated in Assyrian royal inscriptions and letters, this has not been a significant focus of study in the historiography of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Eckhart argues that any historical investigation has to include the voices of those victims of Assyria's military expansions. Though Assyrian sources may mention such perspectives, the data is limited. As such, the study of biblical records about these episodes should be evaluated constructively. Eckhart analyzes the extent to which we may utilize biblical texts to examine, quote, the edges of the Assyrian Empire, close quote. Among his data set, he includes sections of 1st Isaiah and the book of Nahum, and asks how specific groups in Israel and Judah viewed Assyria in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. To what degree, however, should these biblical texts be characterized as opposition literature? And what does this categorization mean in an Assyriological framework? Opposition in what way? We might also distinguish carefully between the representation of Assyria in prophetic books versus narrative prose, such as 2 Kings 18 to 19, and its construction of social networks and described international diplomacy. Within a given prophetic book, like Nahum, Eckhart highlights rhetorical strategies that are employed, like mockery in the dirge of Isaiah 14. The mockery of the king of Bavel, or likely Sargon II, may serve to simultaneously preserve a memory of foreign rule and undermine imperial ideology through careful literary construction. The repulsiveness of Nineveh, likewise, is the focus of Nahum's vision in chapter 3. Following the NRSV, I am against you, says the Lord of hosts, and will lift up your skirts over your face, and I will let nations look on your nakedness and kingdoms on your shame. Sarcasm and mockery also reverberate in other prophetic texts, like Habakkuk 1, 10 to 11, in the context of imminent foreign rule. At kings they scoff, and of rulers they make sport. They laugh at every fortress and heap up earth to take it. Then they sweep by like the wind, they transgress and become guilty. Their own might is their God. Taken together then, the passages present the voices of the conquered from a peripheral locale of empire. Jesse DeGratto's paper, in turn, expands the dialectic between biblical studies and Assyriology beyond the categorization of Hebrew Bible as opposition literature. In his paper, Jesse notes that the biblical text at times represents a praxis of cultural hybridity in response to an empire. With Isaiah 10 as the primary focus, he effectively explains that biblical passages may reflect a broader encounter with Assyrian hegemony, and that there is, quote, historical variation in imperial organization, close quote. To speak of moments of resistance is to maintain that the spectrum of engagement with Assyria is not solely one of explicit opposition to the other. Jesse offers a new approach by arguing that the biblical corpus nuances the label of resistance literature, that is, reacting against the imperialist oppressor and under the control of the oppressor. The oppressed group, in this case the Judean community, responds in ways that simultaneously mimic and oppose the projection of imperial authority to draw on Homi Bhabha's theoretical model. As reflected in Isaiah 10:5-11, the imagined Assyrian monarch, quote, threatens to inflict upon Jerusalem and its statues what he has already done to Samaria and its worthless images, close quote. At the same time, however, the text rejects imperial rule through various techniques and levels a critique against cultic statues. Here, the propagandistic nature of the Assyrian practice of godnapping is reconstituted in the passage. As revealed in Isaiah 10:9-11, such a policy is documented and then rejected by questioning the efficacy of the cultic statues to denote Yahweh's presence. The divine images, Elilim, are not gods and are deemed futile by Isaiah, perhaps much like the Elilim of Isaiah 2:8, 18, and 20, the work of one's hands that shall utterly pass away. As such, the assertion of the inefficacy of these icons in the chapter comprises the local Judean response to Assyrian propaganda. While the life of Judeans may be situated under Assyrian political control, the Bible offers another lens on the construction of identity and resists, specifically, as Jesse says, Assyrian claims to speak for deities in the southern Levant. Through the prisms of our presentations today, texts from the Hebrew Bible increasingly help to reveal the discourse about social identity for at least one minority group living within Mesopotamia. Perhaps based on the available data, it comes as no surprise that all three case studies largely engage with prophetic literature and prophetic books specifically, not narratives and clearly not epistolary material. While considering our speakers' papers for today, I was reminded of a statement by the historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi in his work Zachor, Remember, where Yerushalmi writes, quote, even in the Bible, historiography is but one expression of the awareness that history is meaningful and of the need to remember. Yet the meaning of history is explored more directly and more deeply in the prophets than in the actual historical narratives. The collective memory is transmitted more actively through ritual than through chronicle, close quote. We should take note of the genre of prophetic literature as a textual locus and inquire of its significance to the theme of this conference and the construction of ancient history. There is no doubt that a certain increasing urgency is refracted in the books of the Hebrew Bible vis-a-vis the presence of Assyria and Babylonia. But why may the genre of the prophetic book nevertheless be a nexus for intra-Judean minority dynamics and cultural hybridity? And what is at stake in our categorization of minority literature, opposition literature, and resistance literature for the study of culture and history? How do we employ this terminology consistently across biblical studies and Assyriology? The fields of Hebrew Bible and Assyriology are not simply two sides of a rotating mirror. There is not one answer across biblical books or in any one book to the question of how to be a minority. Rather, the case studies today break down certain oppositions that have been historically compared in successive generations, seeing relationship and interaction in new places and in varied types of data. In doing so, they give voice to the identities of ancient peoples and demonstrate that the two disciplines in question indeed are interlocutors in the academy. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We will now move to our final scripted word, which is from Jack Sasson, the former Mary Jane Worthen Professor of Jewish Studies and Hebrew Bible at Vanderbilt Divinity School, now identifying as unemployed. Please, Jack.
Thank you very much. And I'm very pleased to follow on Julie's presentation because she does exactly what a person ought to be doing and which, alas, I will not. So forgiveness galore to everyone. I am the last in a company of illustrious colleagues, with not one of us least among them. but I do believe I am the oldest, even older than Peter Machinist. I have been attending professional societies since the mid-60s, and if you indulge me for the next few minutes, I would like to briefly attend to the lectures we have heard these past 2 days by harking back to an SBL, ASOR, AOS kind of session of the mid-1960s. In doing so, I am presuming that an occasional foray into the historiography of our profession might sharpen an awareness that fruitful scholarly contributions end only in a comma or a semicolon, but never on a fully rounded period. While not as crowded as they might be today, the meeting chambers in the 1960s would have featured the powerful voices of giants, among them Albright, DeVoe, Porada, Moran, Malamat, Goetze, Finkelstein, Gordon, Gelb, Gutterbach, and Gaster, with many others hurling thunderbolts from across the oceans. Their own students, too, were beginning to carve their own niches. The Great Wars were behind us then, but the archaeological discoveries in their interval had seduced biblical scholars into the cushy world of second millennium text. We still shared 19th century certitudes then, among them that nothing of the past can be hidden from us if we ask the right questions of the documents already available. Our tools were mostly historical criticism, with folklore and stichometry guiding us into perfect appreciation of vast treasures. The joy of texts and the rich revelations they provided simply took the Academy by storm. Ugarit on poetry, Alalach on heroic sagas, Nuzi on anthropology, and Mari on prophecy and tribal institutions. Especially on this continent, scholars exulted in the way they affirmed the birth of Israel and its tribal system, recaptured the world and careers of the patriarchs, mapped out the poetic and legal languages of Moses at Sinai, charted the progress of the Exodus, chronicled the capture of the Promised Land, and plotted the rise of Hebrew kingship. All along, archaeology was there to substantiate each step we took. Sure, there was resistance, but it came mostly from Europeans and largely from folks of the German persuasion. But we ask ourselves, what did those nihilists know? While we are in virtual mode, let me invite our panelists of this afternoon to drop in on some of the sessions of the mid-1960s. Marty will not be surprised that the debate about each and every aspect of Ezekiel research was hardly less contentious then than now. With Hebrew soil stubbornly refusing to deliver contemporaneous textual versions of anything biblical, we were then on the cusp of yet another revisionist shift in the cyclical debate on composite versus unified construction of any biblical book. We argued whether Ezekiel, no less than other biblical personalities for that matter, was a figment of someone's imaginations, including ours. We debated where to geographically position any of them, their observations, their beliefs, and their audiences. The difference is that we were then stubbornly wedded into the historical and textual method and had not yet fully unlocked the myriad of interpretive tools that began to sprout fully armed by the mid-70s. Still, hardly deployed then were the sophisticated layering of arguments we find in today's presentations. In the aftermath of the horrifying abuses of power still fresh in our minds, we had began to refine our perception of Israel's response to occupations by recognizing the contrast between regional ethnicity, gestated in ancestral DNA, and national identity, the result of adaptation, acculturation, or assimilation of dominant and dominating norms. Tendentiousness in the Assyrian record was certainly underlined, even if hardly anyone then fully diagnosed the doubts and inner turmoil that lurked in non-monumental sources. I cannot recall whether colonization and its damages generated exegetical perspective on Hebraic consciousness. While our colloquium is firmly set within the first millennium, given my own interest, let me hark back to some of the themes in yesterday's presentations by casting a nostalgic glance to the waning days of our last millennium, when biblical scholarship on most subjects had not yet fully gravitated toward the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid anchorings. In my opinion, the shift has had a significant impact on Assyriology as well. For, acknowledged or otherwise, biblical research in academia still remains the tail that wags the funding of ancient Near Eastern studies. While Sumerology and first millennium positions, thank God, continue to hold their own, I can't say the same for the once dominant investment in Old Babylonian studies. In consequence, as far as biblical scholarship is concerned, the Mari archives that I love so much might as well be shelved on the moon. I lament this occultation, if only because there remain tons to learn from inspecting their treasures, not so much about Israel's history, but about the Hebrew experience. Since biblicists largely gave up exploiting them, thousands of Mari tablets are now published, among them a royal epic crafted in the early days of a living king, yet a teaching paradigm for the triumph of bloated rhetoric over historical realism. Hundreds of juicy letters are now available, some of them with more lines than the entire book of Obadiah, with many delivering garrulous, jargon-free prose that matches the elegance, intimacy, and wit of Hebrew narrators. From them, we learn lots about tribal ethnicity and hegemonic identity, and about the powerful drive to control and dominate vassals with inconstant loyalties. There were Elamites, Hurrian, Turuku, and Semites of different brandings, distinguishing themselves by their languages and adherence to inherited norms. In Mari itself, the world was run by West Semites with powerful attachments to their own confederations, primarily Benjaminite, Ben-Simalite, and Sutus, with subgroups, each with multiple allegiances and dialects. Interestingly, one of Mari's rulers did not master Amorite, his denizen's tongue, but preferred to communicate in Akkadian, normally a vehicle for the scribal world. He was regarded as effeminate and loves music, so he was strange. That was Yasmachadu. Sumerian remained for the learned. We never discovered directly what this goulash eventually turned into, for the archives abruptly end when Babylon took over the control of the city, leaving it an emptied tell. Luckily, we still have tons of documents to inspect. Go there if you wish to learn about creating prophecies from fragments of other oracles, about usurping thrones, about making treaties, about forging royal letters, about declaring wars, besieging cities, deceiving allies, and trapping enemies and armies. Find out how to initiate scandals, spread false rumor, set up ordeals, corrupt judges, spy and betray, exact vengeance, kidnap for profit, and seduce for sport. Do you want to learn about Habirus who abetted the rise and fall of soldiers of fortune long before their Amarna avatars? Or to meet Samsi Erach, a perfect prototype for the likes of an Abimelech, a Jephthah, or even a David? Would you like to entangle how a king might set up a triumphant stela in a faraway place, yet never leave his own comfortable throne? Do you like to discover the earliest formulation of the domino theory, interested in meeting diviners who just want to stop bloodening their hands, or to find men who threaten to cut spouses into 12 pieces, priests who bribe well for a top job in a local temple, musicians who are expert at composing diatribes against others, lots more. So much is there to discover and enjoy, but make it easier on yourself and simply get a copy of ARM 31, Jean-Marie Durand's recent first volume of a trilogy of documents, hundreds of them, by the way, on the early years of King Zimri-Lin. I dare you not to be entranced by the dossiers of such personality as the acid-tongued Banu, the practical Sumuhadu, and Khabduma Dagan, a precursor to all the Rodney Dangerfields you have known. Those were three Shapitus governors who did not survive long the brutal mayhem and court intrigues that always surround a usurper's right to power. Think of the stories about Saul and David about that. I think you'll find enough tidbits there to enhance your appreciation of the remarkable ways Hebrew narratives absorbed, then reimagined diverse aspects of the human experience. But enough of this. Let me zoom out from this Jeremiad, but not without commending our hosts, Jeff and Ranfield, and their ether high priestess, Julia Barrett, for organizing and staging such splendid feasts for the mind. As well, let us congratulate ourselves, not just for having Be'ezrat Hashem so far survived this COVID month with our brains, imagination, and curiosity intact, but also for harvesting from our wonderful presenters many clues with which to continue our conversations for the foreseeable future. I fully expect to follow their suggestion for at least one generation. Inshallah, maybe also one more beyond that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all speakers. I invite now all the plenary, the main speakers and respondents to join us by camera. And the way it's going to work in the remainder of our time is that I first will ask the main speakers if you would like to comment on the feedback from and the points raised by the respondents. And when each of the speakers has had a chance to do that, and perhaps if there's any follow-up from the respondents, then we have some questions already being put into the chat, and I will field those in the order that I have received them. So we begin with Marty. Would you like to respond?
Yes, thanks, sure. So thanks, Jack, for talking so long about Mari. I believe to have spent a few hours with those texts, mainly those that somehow have to do with prophecy. And of course, I mean, I didn't really realize how little biblical scholars today actually use this material. But you are probably right. You don't run into all too many references to Mari letters in texts written by biblical scholars. So we really need those texts, and they really should be translated into English, because the language proficiency in our field is dramatically dropping. My students can only read English. It's no way I can give them German books to read, let alone French.
Oh my mind.
So Jack, thank you for doing your share of that translation project.
I get 10% of the cut of any book written on Mari. This is why I do it. What can I say?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So Julie, you made a really interesting note about the attitudes of the displaced people towards their homelands. And this is something I think modern anthropologists have been studying. I know only one name, Liisa Malkki. To judge by name, she must be Finnish. I don't know her. but she has published a book that then Ezekiel scholarship seems to know. So both Carly Crouch and Casey Strine, I think, have, maybe Jonathan Stöckel have referred to her book about the Hutu, the Hutu refugees from Rwanda who has escaped to Tanzania, and how they talked about their homeland there. So this is probably somehow comparable with the situation in Jerusalem / Babylonia. Only I think it is not fully comparable, because I don't expect those Hutu refugees to use such an eloquent ideological language about their homeland Rwanda as the book of Ezekiel does about Jerusalem. And also what is somehow Ezekiel, whoever that is, I mean, I'm talking about the authors of the passages of the book of Ezekiel, is in a strange way both obsessed with Jerusalem and distanced with it. So there seems to be nothing good in Jerusalem, except for in the future. It's a visionary future when that place is like brought back to what it should be. But Ezekiel says nothing actually about contemporary Jerusalem or about what used to be there. And this is interesting, and I just don't quite understand why, because really the book of Ezekiel is not very interested even in what used to be there, except for that according to chapter 8 it was wrong, and this is why God got angry. But why then this obsession? Why does it remain that important anyway? If everything went wrong, if the city sinned so badly that God himself had to abandon the city, what is so valuable in it that Ezekiel has to talk about it all the time? This is the kind of tension within the book that I can't really fully understand.
And it's not exactly what you're saying. It doesn't strike me as just being in one chapter or in chapter 8, but consistently, coming back to
yes.
The image, not right again, not the physical as you've explained and demonstrated, not the what the physical representation of the city, perhaps ideological, but why keep returning to it if it's not of significance in the reconstruction of the identity of the groups?
Yeah. And this is somehow also one of the reasons why I do prefer Babylonia as the birthplace of the book of Ezekiel, because the distance is needed in order to come up with such kind of arguments.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Eckhart, would you like to respond to your respondents?
Yeah, thank you very much for your interventions. The points you made were all very good, and I do not really disagree with anything you have been saying. Julie, you pointed out politely but correctly that, calling the Hebrew Bible opposition literature, of course, wouldn't be correct in this sense. You could say the title of my lecture is a little too essentializing, and I think I have made it clear that I'm well aware of the fact that, of course, the responses you find in the Bible to Assyrian imperialism are more nuanced than just sort of claiming it's all about opposition. In this regard, I think, Jesse, you made very good points with which I completely agree, also with the theoretical background, and that there is also mimesis at place, that there's emulation of Assyrian, and later on, of course, even more strongly perhaps of Babylonian models. I think is something that is definitely correct, that I would completely agree with. You also asked that maybe we should look more closely at the actual loci of this opposition, if there was any. And that's also absolutely correct. I didn't talk about that at all. I mean, there's a limit of time, of course, as well, but it is, of course, very much a question. I mean, who were these circles where this opposition was primarily found? And I mean, this priestly sector, to what degree does that sector overlap with the with the royal sector in Judah? I think these are interesting questions that still, that still require an answer, and I'm grateful for those. Jack, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting observation that you made, that the second millennium was not represented at this conference is probably not only because the organizers deliberately said, no, we don't want that, but it does reflect certain developments in the field. And you're also right, I think, of course, that this opens up interesting questions. When you look, let's say, I mean, to talk about something completely different, that biblical creation accounts, where we do look for? Do we look for the Ugaritic evidence from the second millennium, because that's sort of closer in space to the emergence of what we imagine the biblical books are located in the Levant, and perhaps also linguistically, or do we look for what we believe is a more contemporary tradition that would be the one we might find in Babylonia with the Enuma also? And I think it's important to keep that in mind, that the final judgment on these things is still out, and that it is important to keep in mind that there's also this earlier evidence. And I think, Marty, you're right, to some extent. It's the Romanica non leguntur thing that indeed, I mean, as Chapin once told me, previously he was at least still quoted, even though no longer read, and now he's no longer quoted, because he's writing in French. And to some extent that applies to Ugaritic as well. And yes, it's certainly a problem. I would say, though, that maybe, I mean, I could even to some extent join in your nostalgia here, because my impression is that when you look at Hebrew Bible studies from the outside, that in recent years there's ever been more increasing emphasis on the study of the Second Temple period. And I mean, dealing with Assyria is considered problematic because we have to make all these assumptions about the origins of certain texts. I mean, that applies to Isaiah or to the Deuteronomy 17 as well. I haven't really been able to talk about that, but if you talked, I mean, I'm not a specialist on that, but if you are, of course, you get into these endlessly complex questions of how to date these segments of texts. And that, of course, is really important when you want to make a point about how they actually respond to specific historical experience or not. And I think many biblical scholars are now simply tired of these discussions, and for that reason they have moved to sort of safer shores, and that means away from the origins, and rather sort of moving into reception also, where they look at non-canonical books and compare them with the canonical tradition, and so on and so forth. So that my impression is that nowadays it's not only that the French literature is no longer read, but that many students in Hebrew Bible no longer really take Akkadian. I mean, here at least, I don't have the impression that you have enormous numbers of divinity students who are really learning Akkadian and are eager to do that. So I think this may be sort of a constant trend towards ever more rejuvenation, which, however, may not actually be necessarily always what one would wish for. So that's what I would sort of say to both of you for the time being.
Thank you. So then Jesse DeGrotto, please.
Oh, I just want to say thanks for those thoughtful and considered responses. I don't have anything to add right now. So thank you, guys.
Do the respondents have any comments to the panelists' responses?
Well, actually, it is interesting, all this. What I find ironic is that the reliance of biblical scholars on outside text have, because of their decision that most of these biblical texts are post-exilic, exilic, post-exilic, whatever, this is where their origin is. They are relying on a lack of any information that would be useful, because the Achaemenid material is mostly comes to us mostly from third sources, Greek sources, and what have you, we still have a very hard time really seeing what the Persian Empire was like from within its own material. And the comparison become easier that way because you don't have that much to work with. But in my notion is that if you are trying to understand what drives the Hebrew, something beyond, let us say, the theology, which constantly is trying to explain why is it that the only God that can ever exist still gets people beating up the people who believe in him. This is a fundamental drive to try to justify, to apologize, if you want to use the old term, for it. On the other hand, you have this big problem we all have today in trying to decide exactly what drove the Hebrew to choose certain things to highlight, to amplify, to develop, and ignoring other things. So it's a tension in some ways, and I think in some ways biblical scholarship is still trying to make a decision on what material it is that would be useful to understand the Hebrew context better. We have always, even in my days, which is not that long ago, depended on outside perceptions of how things work, trying to bring them in, but we don't stay with them too long. I remember days when McLuhan was everywhere, where Turner was everywhere, where I don't know what, who else? I mean, there were tons of them. They come in and they come out. They all have something to say for about 3 weeks, and then everything disappears until the next one. So I want to know, how is it that you take someone like Baba and integrate him in such a way that we no longer need to continue to deal with what he had said, but now decide on what it is that we say ourselves by looking into our own text. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I just don't like the frivolity of the field sometimes.
Were you asking specifically?
I'm not asking anything. I'm just opinionating because what the heck.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I find Baba useful in part because he calls attention to the way we are historically situated as interpreters, right?
Right.
And so since we cannot simply suspend ourselves in outer space with these texts and encounter them afresh or encounter them from the perspective of the ancient people, we need to be aware of what assumptions we bring in as we read these texts. So an example of this would be the way that Assyria tends to be treated as imposing some sort of religious or cultural norms on people. Many, many years after Kogan wrote a book showing definitively that this is not Assyrian practice. And yet, even in the face of really compelling evidence from antiquity, people tend to just sort of assimilate their idea of how an empire ought to work, how an empire works, and then impose that on Assyria. So I think often the role of theory is as much applying it to ourselves as it is engaging a text with the theory.
That's true. That is true.
Okay. Let's see, where were we? Julie, did you want to respond at all to what's been said?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
Nothing
So,
further.
I'll start on my list of questions. I have David Vanderhooft has questions for all three main speakers. I'll read one at a time so that you don't have to sit there remembering your question. The first one's for Jesse. What is the significance of the shift from Elil and Psilim, vis-a the nations, to Elilim, Samaria, and Atzavim, Jerusalem, in Isaiah 10:10-11? And there's a second part, but I don't know if you want to have both at once.
Let's do one at a time.
Okay.
So I think there is an equation being made, especially with the use of Elil to characterize nations, and then Elilim to characterize objects, between the impotence of the nation itself and the sort of significance or ability of a statue to represent or to definitively mark the presence of a deity. In terms of the range of terms, having Pasilim, Elilim, Atzabim, all of these are, well, the root of Elilim is debated. but potentially is related to words connoting weakness, and you may have that because of the phonetic similarity that may be triggered even if this is not the historical root, right? In addition, we have words like Pasilim and Atzabim, which come from roots that denote physical creation. So I think part of what's going on here is the use of many roots or the use of many words that call attention to the way that these cultic statuary are physically created as physical objects.
Okay, the second part of the question is despoilation of statues in the sense of capture and removal is one sort of phenomenon. Is defacement and destruction, possibly indicated by Harrison's excavation of the defaced goddess at Taniat, another? What is the difference?
Yeah, so iconoclasm, the actual destruction of a deity or divine image, is extremely, extremely rare. Whereas the kidnapping of them, because they can then be ransomed back for renewed submission, is quite common. So aside from the time that Sennacherib does lose control of his troops in Babylon, and there is some sort of cultic destruction that happens there. But in general, when we see statues that are destroyed, and I think this is actually the case for the Tainat statuary, they're of human rulers and figures who are being defaced and destroyed. And so that's a clear political statement about the legitimacy of the rulers, as opposed to incurring the wrath of the god, because within the sort of Mesopotamian system, there's not only would you not deny the reality of the underlying deity inhabiting the statue, but if you were to do that, you would undermine your own program of despoiling and ransoming cult statuary, right? So you want to treat these with the utmost respect.
Can I say something here quickly, very quickly, about
Sure.
the sort of mutilating the faces of gods and goddesses? The problem is we do not know whether any religious ritual takes place before that to desacralize them. And that is important, because if you desacralize a god or a goddess without having done that, then you really are showing a lot of chutzpah on your part. And you may, but if you desacralize them first, you can do anything to them. And we don't know whether they do that or not. They may not, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. David Vanderhooft has another question for Marty. Does the assimilation of Babylonian idioms, thus more than loanwords, indicate that whoever is responsible for Ezekiel had access to the native Babylonian language? Stöckel goes so far as to think of Ezekiel as a, quote, schoolboy, but while that may be hyperbolic, can we imagine access to the stream of tradition?
Yeah, Avi Winitzer talks about Assyriological studies at Tel Aviv, Babylonia. Yeah, David, thanks for the question. You are obviously one of those persons I've been reading and learning a lot from in terms of Babylonian influences in Ezekiel. You have demonstrated a lot of them. I do think that people who actually lived there for generations must have known local languages other than I don't even know whether they how long they continued speaking Hebrew in Babylonia, or whether they converted into Aramaic, which was of course one of the languages there. But Akkadian, of course, Akkadian was the language of the upper class and language of learning, and so you needed to be educated in order to know Akkadian well enough to adopt such ideas that I think we find in the book of Ezekiel. So yes, I do believe that some of the Judeans actually got that education. They don't need to have been many, but some I think did. Otherwise, certain things would be really difficult to explain.
Okay, let's see. I'm just finding my questions here. Anyone need to follow up on this topic, or should I move to the next question? Okay. Let's see. David van der Voort for Eckhart. Does the biblical corpus, e.g. Nahum and Jonah, Isaiah 14, know of the concept of a fall in the Gibbonian sense of fall? Did Assyria fall in the biblical imagination?
May I just quickly make a remark on this question about the Elilim? Because I mean here, what comes to my mind as an Assyriologist is this old etymology that it might derive from the name of the Babylonian god Enlil that was pronounced as Elil or Ilil in the first millennium. I think few people now believe that, but of course it would be an interesting irony in this context. One of these biblical statements about the Elilim, Kol Elohe Ha'amim Elilim, all the gods of the nations are but idols or daemonia, as the Vulgate has it. It was actually quoted in Pater Daimel's Pantheon Babylonicum, somewhat ironically. Anyway, I don't know, but I want to point that out. The question about the notion of a fall in the Bible would, of course, be better asked to someone who's really a Hebrew Bible scholar, and I think David would be Emilio Fabro here. I can only approach that as an outsider. I mean, the question does bring to my mind the kind of strange, perhaps strange, but interesting fact that the fall of Assyria is, of course, not mentioned in the books of Kings, where one would expect it. Of course, this is all narrated very much from the Judean period sort of perspective, but one would imagine that there must have been some sort of chronicle, a Judean chronicle at one point, on which 2 Kings draws. I would imagine that would have included an account of the downfall of the Assyrian Empire, which of course had a major impact on Judah, and yet it's not out there. Nahum, of course, I mean, does clearly allude to, well, some sort of a major disaster that befalls the city of Nineveh and thus Assyria as a whole, and triumphs over it. Whether that's, I mean, and even sort of alluding to certain historical details, Peter Machinist wrote about that, such as reference to the watery, to the role possibly played by rivers or so. Peter Machinist has written about that, and indulges very much in the thought of yeah, I mean, you could call it the fall. I mean, this isn't the word used in the text. So there, I think you do have a record that clearly sees that as a major event, as it was, I think, also seen elsewhere, because it is clearly such an event in the classical tradition, which ascribes it to Konstantopoulos, the last great Assyrian king, and not the actually last king. But the story told there is clearly based on some kind of knowledge of what really happened at the end of well, the Assyrian Empire. So I mean, this must have been an event that really, I mean, you could even argue it was in a way the First World War, if you wish, that must have deeply resonated in the region. So I mean, considering that, then it's perhaps interesting that, except for now, I'm not aware of any biblical text that would really make a big deal of the fall of Assyria.
Okay. So we have a question now from one of the attendants, from Natalie Naomi May, for Eckhart. So you can keep your mic on. There is no proof that the hanging head in the garden scene is that of Toimon, or however you say his name. Contrarily, the epigraph on the bigger garden scene proves that it relates to 645 and not 653. Thus, the head is of Nabu Bel Shumati. Do you have a comment to that?
It's an interesting point. I would have to look into it. I've always thought that you can recognize Teoman from his receding hairline, and that head is in some of the other reliefs. But I mean, I know, Naomi, that of course you have studied this carefully, and I will take that seriously. So I cannot speak ex cathedra here, but this whole connection between Teoman saying, I want to dine in the midst of Nineveh, and the garden scene has not been made by myself, but in an article from 2018 recently by Gilbert. I would have to look at this again. You're right, of course. I mean, the heads keep rolling under Ashurbanipal, who was really not a particularly pleasant person and who enjoyed that sort of thing. And Teoman was not the only one who was beheaded. And Nawab Shumati was another of these people whose heads were put on display. But Teoman's was as well. So I will look into it. But thank you for this note. It's important for me to realize that this isn't quite as clear as I made it seem.
But is the point not that anyone who looks at these pictures from ancient time will think their head could be hanging there anyway? They didn't have to worry about who it was. They just know that that's what can happen to you.
Well, I doubt really that these things were primarily used as propaganda. I think this was mostly so for an internal audience, and this is from the North Palace and probably sort of a more private area in the first place. I think this is sort of Ashurbanipal enjoying himself because he didn't really go on campaign himself, and so he had to sort of indulge in his elaborate choreographies of violence at home. He couldn't do it on the battlefield. And that's what he does, both sort of in these complex displays of violence in near to city gates, where these enemies are put on display together with dogs and bears, and probably also on when he looks at images like this one. So I think this is not so much about making anyone afraid, this specific image, but that's a complicated question, of course.
Okay, then there's a question from Natalie and Naomi May for Jesse. Actually, there's another one a little bit later, but this is the first one. Thank you for a fascinating talk. God napping is a very ancient practice and not exclusively Assyrian. Its purpose evolved through time, and even in the late Neo-Assyrian period, it had different connotations, not only in every particular rule, but in every particular case. I think the second question is on iconoclasm. Based on what are you assuming that it is rare? It is not so. It's just another case of the Assyrian politics towards its enemy gods. So maybe you can do both of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So for the first point, I completely agree. This is a long-standing policy that is developed and further implemented, specifically god napping, in the Neo-Assyrian period. And in highlighting the different paradigms that are offered for understanding god napping by Assyrian kings, these sort of ambivalent and somewhat contradictory paradigms, I want to kind of draw out how this can be seen differently, implemented differently, interpreted differently in different contexts. So yes. In terms of iconoclasm, we only have two references in Assyrian inscriptions to iconoclasm at all. One of them is this famous siege of Babylon, and in the three different accounts we have of it, we can see Sennacherib kind of trying to distance himself from the event. The other, and specifically from the destruction. The other instance is Ashurbanipal, who I don't remember which gods he smashes, but there's a reference to smashing gods. By contrast, we have dozens, I believe, of references to kidnapping gods and ransoming them back. They're comprehensively listed in Stephen Holloway's 2002 monograph. And Shayna Zaya, I think, adduces an additional example in her 2015 article. In terms of iconographic depiction, we don't have any iconographic depictions of a divine statue being destroyed. Sometimes Sargon's siege, the image of the Mutsatsir despoliation is adduced, but that is probably a king. There's no hat, no horned helmet or anything like that on the deity. I think this is also why, or on the statue. I think that's also why the tie knot examples are generally considered to be rulers as opposed to gods. Whereas we have many examples of despoliation in text and in iconography. So I'm arguing based on the evidence that we have. I have no reason to think that iconoclasm is a regular practice if it is very rarely attested in the textual record and not visually at all.
Okay, I'm going to have to say that we can't take any more new questions. The official time is now up, but we can keep going for a little bit so that the questions that I already have get answered. That's my suggestion. So Joanne Skurlock is asking Marty, or commenting, you might want to go with your suggestion of dual identity. The Jewish community in Libya expressed this as having a motherland, Israel, and a fatherland, Libya. I personally checked with a group of Russian Jews. I asked about identity. They said they were Jewish. And I replied that was their motherland and what was their fatherland. The response was, since you ask it in that way, I would have to say Russia.
Yeah, probably it depends how many generations there are in between when are the persons themselves, have they moved from one place to another by force or otherwise, or are there several generations? How many generations you have to go back to find people who actually were in this motherland or homeland or whatever. So I think that makes a difference. Also, political circumstances wherever you are, if you are well taken care of, if your life is good. So I think homeland may be a nostalgic aspect in your life, but if you are brought somewhere by force, then I think it changes. Or if you are a refugee, it makes all the difference. But I think these experiences are really individual and shouldn't be generalized all too much.
Okay, now we have a question from Ryan Schroeder, who is asking, no, I just have to find it again. It slipped here. Since the question is about, this is to all panelists, since the question is about Hebrew Bible scholarship's contribution to Assyriology, someone's paying attention to the overall topic here. That was my comment. And in light of the significance of the Mari texts raised by Dr. Sasson, I wonder if a few of you, I'm thinking especially of Dr. Sasson, Dr. Nissanen, and Dr. Deluti, could offer some thoughts on where there still remains room for biblical evidence for prophecy to help us understand prophecy or divination generally in Mesopotamia, in Mari, and also the Neo-Assyrian Empire. Thanks. Who wants to go first?
Could you repeat that again? Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, so
portion, that's the small portion.
Could you offer some thoughts on where there is still remains room for biblical evidence for prophecy to help us understand prophecy in Mesopotamia?
Well, Marty should speak about that. He has control of all the prophecies.
Yes, I'm trying to understand the question, but maybe I do. So, how really biblical prophecy could help us understand prophecy in general, and not only extra-biblical prophecy that we use to understand biblical prophecy better. Yeah. Yes, I think the biblical, what I call biblical prophecy, and that is prophecy as it is depicted and described and written in the Bible, actually helps us to understand what happened to prophecy in the second part of the first millennium, and how actually this is connected with the whole concept of prophecy, how it developed in Judaism, how it was adopted by Christians, and how we use it even today. We are heavily dependent on the developments that took place in the second half of the first millennium BCE, and even a little bit beyond that, I mean, towards the Common Era. So we have decided that something like Mari and Assyria belong to the same map, so to say, when we talk about prophecy, but that is really a very scholarly way of seeing things. I think most people would talk about prophecy in much more biblical terms. And so now what the Bible might help us to understand better is the process of textualization, the process of prophecy becoming more and more textual divination. And like prophecies became omens to be interpreted by new diviners, like for example in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where I think the whole genre of Pesharim is using prophecies as omens. Even the word Pesher has to do with that. So this probably was not a very coherent answer, but along these lines, I would like to think.
I'll follow up on what Marty said. Oh, I'm sorry, Julie, go ahead. I've said it.
No, please, Jack. And on this subject, though it's my ongoing work, I defer to you and to Marty and to Dominique. No, I just would add that, Ryan, I appreciate the question, and I think this is the subject of my research and book in progress. I think the Hebrew Bible, also the literary representation of prophecy and of the human landscape of prophecy, right? I specifically look at of communication between prophets and kings, and to problematize that a little bit further. And I think that, even though it's literary representation, can be brought into conversation with the networks that we see in the Mari corpus for sure. And I engaged very closely with Dominique's work on this and with Marty's work on this. I think also, though, to Ryan's question, the embodied experience of prophecy that we see in the Hebrew Bible, there may be room there with thinking about the biblical evidence for the embodied experience of prophecy that can speak to and help us understand prophecy in Mesopotamia. And this Mari, but also in the Neo-Assyrian corpus as well. So something else to add to the discussion. But please, Jack, I would love to hear what you say.
I think you did an enormous amount of work on this, and this is really wonderful. I just was thinking that we give a lot of prestige to prophets, as much because of what they represented, but also because of the canonical process that kept them in our view so much.
Absolutely.
When you remember that in the days of Ahab, he had 400 prophets. They were a dime a dozen. And it's the same way in the Mari text. The prophets, the dreamers, and all these people were all there, but only one king seemed to be interested in them, Zimri-Lim. Who knows why? They were not particularly highly placed, and they are coming up with the word. Nothing that they said was ever accepted without being checked with the real prophets, which is the diviner.
Yeah.
And if you want to think of the role of the prophet as someone who really has something to contribute, you've got to think of diviners in Israel without having to have hepatoscopy and all that. They had their Urim and Tumim and all that, but basically, our whole sense of what a prophet does has to be placed within its own cultural moment, and that's it.
We're sort of almost at the end of our time, aren't we, Jeff? There's one more question that I think we can do a final question, and then you'll say some wise words to close. Peter Machinist has a question for Jesse about the syntactic problem of Isaiah 10:10. And then I'll just put all his questions up to Jack Sasson. An interesting comparison of the biblical, well, first he says, an elegant tour de force as always. An interesting comparison of the biblical reception to Nuzi and to Mari. Nuzi parallels now really dead. Mari, as you say, still very much alive and much still to offer. Jesse, what's your comment about the syntactic problem of 10:10?
It's a problem. I assume the question is about the Mi Yerushalayim Umi Shomron at the end of 10:10, and that is not necessarily a syntactic problem in that one could literally translate something like when I snatched the worthless kingdoms and their statues from Judah and Samaria, but that makes no logical sense because Judah has not been conquered, and so it doesn't make sense. From Jerusalem and from Samaria. So I think something's gotten garbled here, or somebody tried to update it at some point after something. And we just sort of have these two little words hanging in there that I've got nothing on that. So open to suggestions though.
That's a great way to end. I don't know. I think that's just the most honest thing we can say as scholars. Jack, did you have a final comment to Peter's comment?
No, Peter, when he gives you such compliments, how can you say that he could be wrong? I mean, he could be wrong.
Okay, thank you guys so much. This has been great fun. And I feel like we've kind of just gotten started on a really important conversation that, is open-ended. So, Jeff?
So first of all, there are so many people we could have invited to this conference. I mean, it really is, the amount of interest very clearly at our maximum attendance. It's both comforting and discerning when you can watch how many people are actually attending a conference. But our maximum attendance at the conference was 122, I believe. There were over 150 registered for the conference, and it's not unusual for folks not to be able to show up afterwards. But I mean, this just tells you how important this topic is and how interested this topic is. And we could have had so many people here, and we could have oriented the conversations in a number of directions. Jack and Julie, you are our, Mari contingent plus Marty, and I mean, so don't think of it as a way that we're trying to exclude. Certainly that's not the case. The fact is that Zoom, as much as it has its advantages in terms of who can attend, and I know some folks were last night was a late night for our folks in Europe. We had people from East Asia attending yesterday and today. I mean, we had all over the place, people were able to attend, but it also has its limits. We can only talk for so much time in Zoom. I myself am zoning out after, this my third day of Zoom conferencing. And so there are limits. But I would like to say thank you, everyone, our panelists, obviously, both folks who gave papers and really thoughtful and engaged responses. Thank you for asking questions, folks who were showing up in the audience. And I will say that this is being recorded. The ILA probably takes a couple of weeks to turn around and do whatever finishing it does before they post it on their on the Boston College Institute for Liberal Arts YouTube page. I believe they've got a YouTube channel that they'll post this to. So if you were unable to attend the first day, you'll still be able to see it in YouTube form. And so thank you for coming. Thank you for joining us. I don't have to say travel safely. All I have to say is end your meeting. And hopefully we'll see you at a real conference sometime soon.
Not to forget to send the notice to Agade so we can tell everyone that it's posted.
When it's posted, I will be happy to do that, Jack. I will be happy to do Jack. That's right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Molly.